had gone up to the mountains for what was supposed to be a quiet break. The cabin was old but solid, tucked away off a dirt road that wound through tall pines and rough ground. It was the kind of place you could only find if you knew it was there. The owner, a friend of a friend, had offered it to me for a week. I thought it would be a good chance to get away from work, away from my phone, and just clear my head. The drive up had been long. The last stretch of road turned to gravel, then narrowed to little more than 2 tracks carved into the ground. By the time I reached the cabin, my car was covered in dust, and my shoulders ached from the constant tension of driving slowly around rocks and potholes. The cabin itself sat on a small rise, surrounded by trees that pressed close on every side. The wood siding was weathered to a gray-brown, the roof had a slight sag, and the porch was soft in spots when I stepped onto it. But the place was quiet, and for what I wanted, it was enough. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and damp air. The furniture was simple: an old couch with thin cushions, a small table with 2 chairs, a bed with a heavy quilt, and a wood stove with blackened sides. There was no electricity except for a single solar-powered lamp, and the only running water came from a pump outside. It wasn't luxury, but I hadn't come for that. I had come for silence. The first day was simple. I carried in my food, mostly canned stuff, and a cooler with ice for meat and milk. I stacked wood by the stove. I checked the locks, which were just basic metal latches on the doors and windows. Then I sat on the porch and listened to the forest. I heard birds, the wind in the trees, and sometimes the distant crack of branches falling deeper in the woods. It was peaceful. That night, after making a small fire in the stove and heating a can of stew, I went outside. The air was colder than I expected, and the stars were so clear that it almost hurt to look at them. There were no distant city lights, no noise, just a black sky filled with white specks and the dark shapes of the trees rising like walls around me. Felt good. The next morning, I decided to walk a bit farther into the woods. The trails weren't marked, but I followed game paths and old tire tracks until I had been walking for nearly an hour. I found a small creek, knelt down, and splashed water on my face. The air smelled clean. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. But then, as I stood up, I saw something that unsettled me. Across the creek, pushed into the brush, was the frame of a tent. The fabric was torn and collapsed, dirty and sun-bleached. Next to it, half covered in leaves, was an old sleeping bag. I thought at first it was abandoned camping gear, but when I stepped closer, I noticed food wrappers, a burned-out fire ring, and a rusty can. It didn't look like it had been used recently, but it also didn't look decades old. I felt uneasy. People camp all over the mountains, of course, but something about the tent felt wrong. It wasn't in a clearing, not in any spot where someone would normally set up. It was hidden, and it looked like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. I didn't stay long. I turned back, retraced my path, and returned to the cabin. The rest of the day, I tried to ignore the feeling in my stomach, telling myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of that abandoned tent. That night, I sat inside with the fire burning. The trees outside made soft creaks as the wind moved through them. I kept glancing at the window, even though I knew there was nothing out there. When I finally lay down in the bed, I pulled the quilt up to my chin and listened to the silence until I fell asleep. On the 3rd day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I chopped some wood, walked the small slope behind the house, and read a book I had brought. By afternoon, I felt calm again. I told myself I had overreacted to the tent. It was probably just some hunter's old camp. But just before dark, while I was standing on the porch, I saw movement between the trees. A shape, quick and low, sliding behind the trunks. My chest tightened. I watched for a long time, but I didn't see it again. I told myself it was a deer. The woods were full of them. Still, when night came, I latched the door and shoved one of the chairs under the handle. I sat by the window for a while, staring out, waiting, but the forest stayed quiet. On the 4th day, I woke early. I stepped outside, and the first thing I noticed was that the ground in front of the cabin looked different. In the dirt and pine needles were marks, disturbed spots, pressed flat as if someone had stood there. I crouched down and studied them. They weren't animal tracks. They were footprints. They weren't fresh enough to show detail, but I could see the shape of a heel, the roundness of a toe. Someone had been standing right in front of the cabin while I was inside. The air went out of me. I looked around the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. But there was nothing, just the tall pines and the stillness of morning. I went back inside and shut the door. The chair stayed wedged under the handle. I tried to think of what to do. The cabin had no phone service. The road was miles away, and even if I drove back, it would take hours to reach town. Maybe it was nothing, maybe just hikers. But hikers didn't walk up to a private cabin in the night and stand there. All day I felt watched. I moved from window to window, peering out, scanning the tree line. The forest seemed too quiet. That night, I kept the fire small so the glow wouldn't spill too far through the windows. I sat in the dark with my ears straining. And sometime after midnight, I heard it. A footstep, slow, heavy on the porch. I froze. Another step followed. The wood groaned. I sat there, barely breathing, staring at the door. The chair under the handle trembled slightly as if something had brushed against it. Then silence. Minutes passed. My throat was tight, my hands shaking. I stayed like that until the sky began to lighten and the birds started calling. When I finally opened the door, the porch was empty. But in the dirt below, there were more footprints. After that, I couldn't sit still. I packed a bag, shoving in food, water, a knife, and a flashlight. I planned to leave, to walk back down the road until I found another house or a car. But when I reached the path, I stopped. There were footprints there too, fresh. They led into the woods, circling the cabin, looping back, like someone had been pacing around all night. I felt pinned. If I went into the woods, I might walk straight into whoever it was. If I stayed, I was a target. The hours dragged. I hardly ate. I hardly moved. I just waited, listening. That night was worse than the last. The steps came again, slow, circling the cabin. At one point, I heard the faint creak of a window being pressed. I gripped the knife in my hand and stared at the glass, expecting it to shatter. But it didn't. Whoever it was only tested the frame, then moved on. The sound of breathing came next, close, right outside the wall where my bed sat. I could hear it through the wood, long and steady. I sat rigid, my chest tight, sweat dripping down my back. It lasted for hours. Steps, pauses, breathing, then silence. When morning came, I stumbled outside, exhausted, and checked the ground. The footprints were everywhere, overlapping, circling, pressed deep into the dirt. I knew then I couldn't wait it out. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. They wanted me scared. They wanted me trapped. I made a plan. When the sun set that evening, I would leave. Not by the road, not by the path. I would cut straight through the forest, moving fast until I hit the creek. From there, I could follow the water downstream until it reached the valley road. I gathered everything I could carry. The knife, a flashlight, the rest of my food. I stuffed it all into my pack and waited for dark. As the sun dipped, I slipped out the back of the cabin and into the trees. I kept my steps quiet, my eyes scanning the shadows. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I moved downhill, keeping the faint sound of the creek in my ears. But then, behind me, I heard steps. Quick, heavy, closing the distance. I broke into a run. Branches slapped my face. Roots caught my feet. The sound followed, steady, not running but moving fast enough that it never fell far behind. I burst into the creek, splashing through the cold water, and forced myself downstream. My lungs burned, my legs shaking, but I didn't stop. At some point, I risked a glance back. In the trees above the creek, a figure stood, tall, still, half hidden by the branches. Watching, I stumbled forward, never stopping, until the water widened and the trees thinned. By the time I saw the glint of metal from the valley road, the sun was rising. I collapsed by the roadside, my pack soaked, my body numb. Eventually, a truck passed, and I waved it down. I never went back for my car. I never went back for the cabin. But I still see the footprints sometimes in my head, circling, pressing close, waiting. And I know that if I had stayed just one more night, The door would... I wanted a quiet weekend to myself, away from the constant noise of work and the weight of people always around me. I rented a cabin deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from the nearest small town. It wasn't a big fancy place, just an old wooden cabin with 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen that had been updated enough to look usable, but still carried the feeling of being decades old. It sat at the end of a dirt road that wound deeper and deeper into the forest until there was nothing else around. No other cabins in sight, no stores, no people. The kind of place where, once you got there, you realized how far removed you really were. The air was cooler there, the trees tall and thick on every side. The sound of birds and the faint rustle of leaves moving with the wind, the only thing to remind me that I wasn't the last person alive. I parked my car near the cabin, unloaded a small bag of clothes, some food I had packed, a few bottles of water, and a flashlight. I wasn't planning to do much, just read, walk, and sleep without alarms or distractions. I remember locking the car and thinking how quiet it suddenly felt once the sound of the engine stopped. The first night was easy enough. I made a simple meal, sat out on the small wooden porch as the sun sank behind the trees, and watched the forest grow darker and darker until only shadows were left. The silence was heavier then, the kind of silence that pressed into your ears until you almost imagined you could hear your own blood moving. I went inside when the night got too cold and stretched out on the bed with my flashlight until I finally dozed off. The second day was just as uneventful. I walked along the dirt road for a while, not going far, then came back and sat outside again, soaking in the quiet. I felt like I was starting to unwind. By the time the sun set that evening, I was beginning to think the trip had been a good idea. But it was the third night when everything shifted. It was close to midnight when I woke up. At first I thought it was just the strangeness of being in a new place, but then I realized what had woken me. There was a sound, faint, deliberate, not the cracking of a branch from some animal outside, not the wind shifting against the old boards of the cabin. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, crunching against gravel. My heart started to hammer instantly, and I held my breath as I listened. The cabin had a small front porch, and beyond that, the dirt driveway where I had parked. The sound seemed to be coming from that direction, moving closer. I didn't move. I lay frozen in the bed, every nerve in me pulled tight, my ears straining to catch every tiny sound. The steps stopped. Silence. Then, after a long pause, the wooden boards of the porch creaked. Someone was standing there. I stared at the ceiling, my chest so tight I felt like I couldn't take in enough air. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that my brain was playing tricks on me in the deep dark silence of the woods. But then the sound came again, slow pressure against the old wood. Whoever it was, they weren't in any rush. They were just standing there, listening. The front door had no window, just a heavy wooden frame with a deadbolt I had locked earlier. I thought about getting up, about grabbing something heavy to use as a weapon, but the thought of making noise terrified me. I stayed still, trying to decide what to do. After what felt like minutes, there was another sound, metal moving lightly. My stomach dropped. The doorknob was turning, slowly, like someone was testing it, seeing if I had locked it. I sat up in bed, hardly breathing, my hands shaking. The knob rattled once, then stopped. Silence again. Then, the sound of footsteps moving off the porch, slow and unhurried, fading into the gravel. After a while, there was nothing, no sound at all. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the bed with my flashlight clutched tight in my hand, staring toward the door. My thoughts ran in every direction. Who it was, what they wanted, whether they had seen my car outside and knew I was here alone. Every small creak of the cabin made me flinch. When the first light of morning finally seeped through the trees, I felt like I had aged years in those few hours. I walked outside, my legs stiff and shaky, scanning the ground. The dirt driveway showed clear footprints leading up to the porch. They were deep, made by boots too big to be mine. The prints stopped at the steps, then turned back and disappeared into the woods. Seeing them there, plain as day, turned my stomach even more. It hadn't been a dream. I thought about leaving right then, packing my bag, getting in the car and driving back to town. But a part of me tried to reason with myself, tried to explain it away. Maybe it was some hunter, maybe some local who had wandered too close by mistake. Maybe they realized the place was rented and left. I didn't want to admit how shaken I was, so I stayed. I told myself it was just one night, that it wouldn't happen again. That night, I triple-checked every lock. I closed the blinds tight and left a light on in the kitchen. I kept my flashlight and my car keys beside me in the bed, telling myself that if anything happened, I could make a run for it. Hours passed in silence. My eyes grew heavy. I thought maybe I would actually sleep. Then, sometime deep in the night, the sound came back. Footsteps, gravel crunching. My chest went cold instantly. My body locked in place. They were back. Slower this time, almost dragging, like they wanted me to hear. They reached the porch. The boards groaned again. The doorknob rattled, more firmly now. Then a pause. Then the sound of fingers sliding along the wood, scratching lightly, as if tracing the edges of the door. I couldn't move. My breathing was so shallow I felt like I was suffocating. Every second stretched like an hour. Then, sudden, loud, a heavy thud against the door, like a shoulder or boot slamming into it. I jumped out of bed, grabbing my flashlight, heart beating so hard I felt it in my throat. The thud came again. The deadbolt held, but I knew it couldn't hold forever if they kept trying. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but I couldn't force myself to open the bedroom door. I stood there, paralyzed, while another slam shook the frame. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence again. Long, unbearable silence. After what felt like forever, I heard the footsteps move away, slower, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. The first light, I walked outside again. The prints were there, deeper this time, showing where they had stood, where they had braced themselves to slam against the door. I knew then that staying was no longer safe. Whoever it was, they weren't random. They knew I was there. They wanted in. I packed my bag in under a minute, throwing everything into the car without caring how it landed. I got into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced back once at the cabin. The porch looked ordinary in the morning light, but the prints in the dirt were still fresh, proof that someone had stood there through the night, trying to get in. Driving back toward town, every bend in the road felt like it was hiding something. I kept expecting to see a figure step out from the trees, blocking the way. I didn't stop until I reached the small gas station near the highway. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never reported it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to explain that I had stayed after the first night, that I had tried to brush it off. Maybe I was afraid they would think I imagined it. All I knew was that I would never go back there. That cabin was supposed to give me peace, but instead it showed me something worse than being alone. It showed me what it felt like to know someone was watching, waiting, and willing to break through the only barrier between us. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night in my own bed, in my own home, and hold my breath, listening, waiting for the sound of gravel under footsteps. I had decided to stay at the cabin alone for a few days, thinking it would give me a break from the noise and pace of my normal life. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who barely used it anymore, and since it was sitting empty, I thought I would make use of it. It was far from town, set back in the woods about 40 minutes from the nearest paved road. I had driven my old truck up there with supplies stacked in the bed, food, water, a cooler with ice, some tools, and a small propane heater since the nights were already cold in this part of the year. The first day went fine. I unpacked, swept the place out, and got familiar with the layout again. The cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, a sleeping corner with a cot, and a small shed outside that had firewood stacked against it. The place was quiet, and after a while, I began to notice just how empty the woods sounded when the wind wasn't moving. At night, it was even more silent, the kind of silence where you can hear your own breathing too clearly, and the creak of the old wood seemed louder than it should be. On the second night, things began to change. I had been sitting inside with a small lantern on the table, writing in a notebook and trying to pass time. Around 9, I heard something crunching outside in the dirt near the steps. At first, I thought it was just a deer moving around, because the place was surrounded by woods, and animals were always nearby. I kept still and listened. The steps didn't sound like an animal though. They were slow, steady, heavy enough to press into the dirt, not light and quick like a deer or raccoon. I didn't move for a while, but then curiosity pushed me to get up. I turned the lantern down low so it didn't shine through the window much, and I went toward the front door. The door had a small square window near the top, but since the lantern was dimmed, I couldn't see much except the faint outline of trees against the night sky. I didn't open the door. Instead, I stood there, frozen, trying to listen. The steps stopped after a few seconds, and then there was nothing but silence again. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob, heart beating harder, waiting for something else to happen. After a few minutes, I finally walked back to the table and tried to focus on my writing, but I couldn't. I kept looking up, expecting to hear something else. It was only when I decided to blow out the lantern and go to bed that I heard it again, this time on the side of the cabin. A slow, dragging step like someone was circling. My body went cold, and I just sat there in the dark, not daring to move. The footsteps faded after a while, and I laid on the cot, listening so hard my head started to ache. Eventually, I drifted into a light, broken sleep. In the morning, I went outside to check. The dirt around the steps had marks, long, shallow footprints that were definitely not from an animal. They looked like boot prints, and they circled around the side of the cabin. My chest tightened when I saw that some of them came close to the windows. Whoever it was had been moving slow, careful, and close. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe it was a hunter who had gotten turned around, or someone curious who lived out here. Still, the prints told me they had walked around the cabin at least once. That didn't sit right with me. I stayed busy that day, chopping some wood and stacking it closer to the door, double-checking the locks, and keeping my knife at my side. The unease stayed with me. That night, it got worse. I kept the lantern low again, and after dark, I sat in the corner of the room with my back against the wall, trying to stay awake. Around midnight, the steps came back. This time, they stopped right at the door. The boards of the steps creaked under the weight. I stared at the door, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The knob didn't turn, but whoever was out there just stood for a long time. I tried not to breathe too loud, every muscle in my body stiff. I thought about reaching for the shotgun I had leaned in the corner, but I didn't want to make a sound. After what felt like forever, the steps moved again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin just like the night before. I barely slept at all after that. By morning, I was drained, jittery, and on edge. I walked the perimeter of the cabin and found more prints. This time they were fresher, pressed deep into the dirt around the back where the ground was softer. The sight of them made me feel sick. On the third night, I decided to test something. I stacked a small pile of empty cans just inside the door so if anyone tried to open it, they would fall and make noise. I also left a piece of wood leaning against the back window frame in a way that would fall if someone tried to push it open. It wasn't long after midnight when the sound came again. First the crunch of steps, then the creak of the porch. I sat up in the cot, clutching the shotgun. My ears strained for the sound of the cans, but they didn't fall. Instead, I heard a faint brushing sound against the wall, like someone running their hand along the wood. It moved slowly around the cabin. I held the gun tighter, palms sweating, waiting for a sound of forced entry. Nothing came crashing in though. The brushing stopped after a while, and once again the woods went silent. By the fourth day, I was worn out, my nerves raw. I debated packing up and leaving, but a stubborn part of me didn't want to run off just because someone was lurking around. I told myself it might be over. Maybe it was just someone messing with me for a couple nights. That night proved me wrong. Around the same time, I heard the steps, but this time they didn't stay outside. The knob on the door rattled. My heart jumped into my throat. The cans I had stacked inside fell over, clattering loud against the floor. I grabbed the shotgun and aimed at the door, my whole body shaking. The rattling stopped immediately, like whoever was out there realized I was waiting. For the next half hour, I sat there in silence, gun aimed, ears straining. Nothing. Eventually, I moved to the window and peeked out just a little. The yard was empty, only faint moonlight over the trees. Whoever it was had either slipped back into the woods or was still out there waiting. The next morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed my things quickly, loaded them in the truck, and got ready to leave. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the truck didn't start. I tried again, pumping the gas, but the engine only sputtered weakly. When I got out to check under the hood, my stomach sank. The battery cables had been pulled loose. That meant whoever was out there had been close enough to my truck and bold enough to tamper with it. I tightened the cables back into place, hands shaking, and after a few tries, the truck roared to life. I didn't wait around. I drove out of there fast, bouncing along the dirt road until I hit the main road. I didn't stop until I reached town. When I finally got home and sat in the quiet of my own place, the reality of it hit me. Someone had been watching the cabin, coming around at night, circling, standing at the door, testing the windows, and even tampering with my truck. I would never know who it was or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. If I had stayed another night, they might have forced their way inside. That thought stayed with me heavier than anything else. I had been alone, unprotected except for the shotgun, sitting in a dark cabin while some strangers circled closer and closer each night. I knew I had barely gotten out before something worse happened. I never went back to that cabin again. I drove up to the cabin later than I planned that Friday night. The road was mostly gravel after the last small town, and I had to slow down to avoid sliding in some of the sharper turns. The sun had already gone down by the time I reached the narrow dirt path that led off the main road, the one that climbed up through the trees and ended right at the clearing where the cabin stood. My headlights bounced against the branches as I crept along, the crunch of tires over loose stone echoing strangely in the night air. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who let me use it whenever I wanted some time alone. It wasn't fancy, just a single-story wooden structure with 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living area with an old wood stove. The place was far enough from any main road that I knew once I was inside, it would be just me, the dark woods, and whatever silence the night carried. That silence was exactly what I came for. I parked the truck in front, cut the engine, and stepped out into the cool night. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The cabin stood quiet, shadowed under tall trees that blocked most of the moonlight. I carried my bags up to the porch, the old boards creaking under my steps, and unlocked the front door. Inside, it smelled the same as always: dry wood, faint dust, and the lingering trace of smoke from the stove. I set my bags down and went through my usual routine. I checked that the windows were latched, put some bottled water in the small fridge, stacked kindling by the stove, and laid out my sleeping bag on the couch since I didn't feel like setting up one of the small beds. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind outside. I felt calm. After a quick sandwich, I stepped back out on the porch to take in the silence. The forest stretched dark all around, tall pines and thick undergrowth. The gravel path I had driven up was hidden now, swallowed in blackness. I knew there were no close neighbors. Maybe the nearest cabin was 2 or 3 miles away, and that sense of isolation was both peaceful and unsettling. Out here, every small sound carried farther. I sat there a while listening. Crickets, an owl calling in the distance, the faint crack of branches in the wind. After half an hour, I went back inside, locked the door, and stretched out on the couch with my sleeping bag. The first night passed quietly. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight coming through the small front window. The forest outside looked different in the day, calm and harmless. I made some coffee on the propane stove, then stepped outside with the mug in my hand. The clearing looked as it always did, a patch of grass and dirt ringed by trees. My truck sat where I left it. There were no signs of animals or people around. I spent most of the day walking short trails around the cabin, chopping a bit of firewood, and reading. The hours went by slow, which was how I liked them. I wasn't here for excitement. That evening, though, things began to feel different. Around sunset, I walked to the edge of the clearing to watch the light fade through the trees. The forest grew darker, and I noticed something strange about the dirt near the path where my truck sat. It looked disturbed, as if someone had stepped there recently. The prints weren't clear, but the soil was loose enough to hold shallow impressions. At first, I told myself it was probably mine from the night before when I carried my bags in. But when I compared, the direction didn't match. The prints were facing toward the cabin, not away from it. I crouched and studied them for a while, but the light was fading fast, and soon I couldn't see details anymore. I brushed it off and went back inside. Still, it stayed in my mind. That night, as I lay on the couch with the stove crackling low, I felt restless. The wind outside had died down, but every so often, I thought I heard something faint, like a stick breaking. Each time I sat up and listened hard. It would fade, leaving me unsure if it had been real or just the cabin shifting. Around midnight, I got up and checked the door. Locked. I peered through the small front window but saw nothing except darkness and faint moonlight on the clearing. I went back to the couch, but sleep didn't come easy. The following morning, I walked out front with my coffee and went straight to the dirt near the truck. The light made things clearer. The prints were there. They weren't mine. The shape looked like boots, larger than my own. Someone had been near the cabin. The air felt colder as I stood there, staring at the ground. I looked around the clearing, into the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching me. There was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent that day on edge. Every snap of a branch in the woods made me glance up. I checked my truck twice to make sure it would start if I needed to leave. I even kept the axe I had used for firewood leaned inside by the door, within reach. By late afternoon, I debated packing up and going home, but part of me felt stubborn. Maybe it had been some hunter passing through, or someone lost who cut across the clearing. It didn't mean they had any reason to come back. When night fell again, I forced myself to stay calm. I lit the stove, ate some canned food, and tried reading to keep my mind busy. The hours crept by slow. At some point in the night, I heard it, a scrape against the side of the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, listening hard. The sound came again, faint but clear, like something dragging lightly against the wooden wall. Then it stopped. I sat up, gripping the axe handle. My ears strained. Silence pressed in heavy. After a long time with nothing more, I convinced myself maybe it had been a branch swaying in the wind. I lay back down, but my eyes stayed open until dawn. The third morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was soft from dew, and I noticed marks along the wall where the sound had come from. Scratches in the wood, faint but fresh. They were too high to be from any animal I knew. The realization that someone had been outside during the night made my stomach tighten. Whoever it was had come close enough to touch the wall while I was inside, just feet away. I thought about leaving again, but leaving meant driving down a narrow dirt road through miles of forest. And if someone was out here, I wasn't sure I wanted to be on the road alone. At least in the cabin, I had walls, locks, and the stove to keep me warm. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave in the morning. That day dragged on heavy. I didn't enjoy the woods anymore. I didn't walk the trails. I stayed close to the cabin, always watching the trees. When darkness came, I built the fire in the stove bigger than usual, just for the comfort of the glow. I sat in the chair with the axe across my lap, listening to every creak. Around midnight, the sound returned. Not a scrape this time, but slow, deliberate footsteps in the clearing outside. The crunch of weight on gravel. They circled unhurried, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. My heart hammered. I held the axe tighter, too scared to move to the window. The steps paused near the porch, then shifted again, fading toward the trees. Silence returned. I stayed awake the rest of the night, body tense, every nerve stretched tight. By morning, I made up my mind to leave. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into bags without care. I doused the stove, locked the cabin, and loaded the truck. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, loud and comforting. As I pulled out of the clearing, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood quiet under the trees, smoke from the stove chimney still faint in the air. But what caught my eye wasn't the cabin. It was the edge of the woods. A man stood there, half hidden by the trees, watching. He didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't raise a hand. Just stood there, still and silent, as I drove away. The sight burned into my mind. The boots, the size, the certainty that it had been him circling the cabin at night. I kept driving, gravel spitting under the tires, until I reached the main road. I didn't stop, didn't look back again. The drive home felt longer than ever, every turn of the wheel heavy. My mind replayed the nights in the cabin, the sounds, the marks, the slow footsteps. By the time I reached town, the tension finally broke, leaving me exhausted and shaky. I stopped at a gas station, sat there with the engine off and let myself breathe. I never went back to that cabin again. That was the last time I stayed there, and even now, years later, the memory hasn't faded. It wasn't the cabin itself that unsettled me. It wasn't even the isolation. It was the knowledge that out there, in the dark woods, a stranger had been watching long enough to circle, to scratch the walls, to stand outside as I lay awake inside. The silence I once wanted became the very thing that trapped me, because when there's no one else around, the only thing you can hear is the one who shouldn't be there. And that night, someone was there, and he wanted me to know it. I had been looking forward to that weekend for weeks. My work had been grinding me down, and the thought of escaping to the small cabin in the woods felt like the only thing keeping me from snapping under the weight of everything. The cabin wasn't mine, but it belonged to an old family friend who let me use it whenever I needed to get away. It sat on a slope by a large lake, with trees all around and a gravel path that twisted for miles before it finally connected to the main road. The place was quiet, simple, and completely cut off. No cell phone signal, no internet, and no neighbors in sight. Just a wooden box with a roof, a deck facing the water, and silence all around. The first day was uneventful. I drove up with a cooler of food, a few bottles of water, and some gear. The air was crisp, and the road crunching under my tires made me feel like I was breaking away from the rest of the world. The trees closed in thicker the farther I went, and by the time I reached the cabin, it felt like I was in a different place entirely, separated from everything that made me stressed. The cabin looked the same as always. Small porch, single front door with a lock that had seen better days, 2 small windows on the front side, and a chimney that hadn't been used in years. I unlocked it, pushed the door open, and breathed in the old smell of wood and dust. I didn't bother unpacking much. I just put some water bottles in the corner, threw my sleeping bag on the bed, and sat outside on the deck to watch the water. That first night was calm. I ate a simple meal of canned soup heated on a small gas stove, then walked around the property with a flashlight before turning in early. The air was cold enough that I pulled the sleeping bag tight around me and listened to the distant sound of owls while I drifted off. It was the second night when things began to feel different. During the day, I had gone for a long walk around the lake. The trail was narrow and not often used, but I enjoyed the quiet crunch of dirt under my boots. I saw a few deer in the distance, watched a hawk circle above the water, and even spotted fresh tracks that looked like they belonged to a coyote or maybe a wolf. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dropping behind the trees, and I was tired but calm. I made another meal and sat on the porch until the last light faded. It was only when the woods grew completely dark that I noticed how still everything had become. The night before, there had been the sounds of frogs and crickets, but that second night, it was like the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off at first and went inside. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was just the silence that had pulled me from sleep, but then I realized I had heard something, a sound outside. It was faint, but it wasn't natural. It wasn't wind, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the lake. It was something else. I lay still in the bed, listening. The old wood of the cabin creaked slightly as the cool air pressed against it. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, heavy, careful footsteps moving outside the cabin. My chest tightened, and I barely breathed. Out here, no one was supposed to be around. The cabin was far off the road, hidden deep in the trees. If someone was walking outside, it meant they had gone out of their way to be here, and that thought made me feel more exposed than I had ever felt before. The steps circled the cabin slowly, crunching against the dirt and fallen leaves. They paused near the front door, then continued around to the side. I could picture someone out there in the dark, walking the perimeter, looking at the windows. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But then I heard the sound again, closer this time. The footsteps had stopped, and now there was the faint sound of something brushing against the wall. A hand, maybe, dragging across the wood. I forced myself to sit up quietly. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't turn it on. I knew that if there was someone outside, showing light would tell them exactly where I was. I just sat, frozen, staring at the window where the moonlight faintly outlined the curtain. After a while, the sound stopped. I waited for what felt like forever, my body tense, ears straining for anything. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under, though it was a shallow, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I walked the property slowly, trying to see if there had been any sign of someone. At first, I found nothing, but when I circled to the back corner of the cabin, I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints, clear as day. Large, boot-shaped prints pressed into the soil right up against the wall. They led around the cabin in a wide circle before vanishing into the trees. My stomach sank when I saw them. I couldn't pretend I had imagined the night before anymore. Someone had been here. Someone had been close. And the thought of them walking around me while I slept made me feel sick. The rest of the day, I was on edge. Every sound in the woods made me snap my head around. I kept the door locked and double-checked the windows. I even considered leaving, but something stubborn in me pushed back. It felt ridiculous to run just because someone had wandered through. Maybe it had been a hiker or a hunter passing by. I tried to convince myself of that, though deep down I didn't believe it. That night, I couldn't relax. I sat up on the bed with my flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. I listened to the silence, waiting for the sound to return. Hours dragged by. I think I drifted off for a while, but when I snapped awake again, the first thing I heard was the faint crunch of leaves. The footsteps were back. This time they were slower, almost deliberate, and they came right up to the window. I held my breath, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The sound paused, and I could feel that someone was standing just on the other side of the glass, only a few feet away from me. I sat motionless. I didn't even blink. Then came a sound that froze every part of me. The soft squeak of the door handle being tested. Whoever was outside was trying the door. It rattled gently, then stopped. Silence. Then, more footsteps moving around the cabin. I heard them fade toward the back. Then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle burning with tension. When daylight came, I went outside again. The footprints were there, clearer than before, pressed deep into the ground by the weight of someone who had lingered. I followed them a short distance into the trees, but they disappeared into the thick brush. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay. It wasn't paranoia anymore. Someone had come back, and they had tried the door. Whoever it was, they weren't just wandering. They wanted inside. I packed my bag in silence, checking over my shoulder every few minutes, convinced that at any moment I would hear footsteps again. The woods were still and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from between the trees. I carried my things to the car quickly, glancing around constantly. My hands shook as I put the key into the ignition, and when the engine turned over, the sound felt too loud, echoing through the empty forest. As I drove down the gravel path, I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. The trees seemed to lean closer, the shadows stretching, and I pressed harder on the gas. By the time I reached the main road, my chest felt lighter, but only slightly. The sense of being followed didn't leave me until I was well out of the woods, miles away from the cabin. Later, when I thought about it, I realized something that chilled me more than anything else. The first night I had woken to footsteps, I had convinced myself I had only imagined part of it. But I remembered the sound of something brushing against the wall. When I checked in the daylight, I hadn't just seen footprints. I had noticed faint streaks of dirt along the wood, like a hand had been dragged across it. Someone had been touching the cabin while I was inside. Someone had been circling, watching, waiting. And the worst part was knowing that if I hadn't left that morning, they would probably have come back again. Maybe the next time, the lock wouldn't have been enough to keep them out. That thought stayed with me long after I left, and even now, whenever I hear a sound outside my window at night, I can't help but remember the cabin and the footsteps circling in the dark. I had been looking forward to that trip for weeks. Life in the city had been loud and crowded, and my body felt like it had been living on coffee and stress for months. The small cabin that I had rented sat far away from the closest town, tucked deep in the trees. I picked it because it was supposed to be quiet, with no neighbors nearby and no constant hum of traffic. I wanted nothing but silence, the kind of silence you feel in your chest, the kind where you can hear the wind pushing through the trees and nothing else. I wanted to spend a few days reading, maybe walking some trails, and sleeping without the sound of sirens in the background. The cabin was simple: a single bedroom, a kitchen, a small living space, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The wood was old, the kind that carried a smell even when nothing was burning, a mix of pine and dampness. The floorboards creaked if I stepped the wrong way, and the windows were thin. Outside, there was a porch with a railing, though most of it was leaning to one side. Beyond that, nothing but forest stretched for miles. The dirt road that led to it was rough, and I had to drive slowly so I wouldn't wreck the bottom of my car. The first day was calm. I unpacked my bag, stacked some food in the cabinets, and walked around the place. The sun slipped between the trees in beams that hit the ground in long stripes. I sat outside until dusk, listening to the crickets, and then I went inside to light a small fire in the wood stove. The quiet was exactly what I wanted. When I finally laid down that night, the kind of sleep that hit me was heavy, like someone pulling a blanket straight over my whole body. The second day, I went for a long walk. The trail I picked was narrow and overgrown in parts, but I pushed through. It wound uphill, and I could feel sweat running down my back as I climbed. The air was cooler under the thicker trees, but still, my shirt clung to me. At the top, the trail opened onto a clearing with a view across a wide valley. I could see the faint outline of other hills far off, rolling into each other like dark green waves. It was the kind of view that makes you forget for a moment about everything else, just you standing still with the sound of the wind and the endless trees. It was only on the way back that I noticed something strange. The trail had patches of mud from a rain that must have come earlier in the week. My own boot prints pressed down into it, but beside them I saw others. At first I thought maybe they were old, but when I bent closer, they looked fresh. The edges of the prints were still clean, not crumbled, not washed over. The size was close to mine, but wider, and the tread of the sole was different. It wasn't an animal. It was another person. That caught me off guard. The cabin was advertised as remote, and I hadn't seen another car on the drive up. The thought of someone else out here made me uneasy. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tracks, following them with my eyes where they bent off from the trail into the trees. For a second, I thought about following just to see, but the deeper I looked into the trees, the darker it seemed, the branches so thick that they looked like they were hiding things. I told myself it was nothing and kept walking back to the cabin. Still, when I got there, I couldn't shake the thought. I looked at the dirt around my car, the soft patches near the porch. I crouched down, scanning for anything. Nothing but my own prints. The place was still, the trees swaying a little with the evening breeze, the light already starting to thin. I told myself that trails always had other hikers. Maybe someone had passed through earlier, even if I hadn't seen them. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every creak of the wood, every tap of a branch against the side of the cabin made my eyes open. I lay still in the dark, the only light the faint glow of the stove, and tried to remind myself how old the place was, how normal those sounds were. But sometime deep in the night, I woke up again, not from a sound, but from a feeling. The kind where your body stirs before your mind does. I opened my eyes, and for some reason, I looked straight at the window. The curtains were thin, and the moonlight slid through them. I couldn't see clearly, but I thought I saw something just past the porch railing. A shape darker than the rest of the dark. My chest went tight and I didn't move. I stared until my eyes watered, but when I blinked, the shape was gone. Maybe it had never been there. I stayed awake for hours after, staring at the window until the sky finally went pale. On the third day, I told myself I was being stupid. I forced myself to go about things normally. I made coffee, sat outside with it, read for a while, and then decided to cut some firewood to keep myself busy. The axe was old, the handle worn smooth, but it worked. I lined up some logs and swung until my arms burned. The air smelled sharp from the fresh wood. When I carried an armful back toward the porch, I noticed something again. In the dirt by the steps, faint but clear, there were prints. Not mine. Not boots either this time. Bare feet. The toes were spread, the heel pressed deep. My throat went dry. They led up toward the steps, but not onto them. Just stopped there. I felt the air change around me then. The silence wasn't the calm kind anymore. It was the heavy kind, the kind where every sound feels watched. I set the wood down slowly and went inside. I locked the door, even though I had told myself I wouldn't bother with locks out here. For the rest of the day, I stayed inside, pacing the small rooms, listening. That night, I barely slept at all. I sat in the chair by the window, staring out. The forest was black, the moon hidden behind clouds. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, but it was impossible to tell if it was real. My head grew heavy, and I must have drifted off because I woke with a start to a sound I knew wasn't part of the cabin. A crunch of dirt just outside. I froze. My ears rang from how hard I was listening. Another step closer, then nothing. I couldn't see out into the dark. My mind raced. My body wouldn't move. I sat there, gripping the arms of the chair so tight that my knuckles hurt. Finally, I forced myself up and grabbed the axe from where I had left it by the stove. I stood with it in my hands until morning came. The next day, I found something on the porch, right in the middle of it like it had been placed there. A small, smooth stone. Nothing special, just round and gray. But I knew it hadn't been there before. Someone had put it there while I was inside. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things fast, shoving clothes back into my bag, barely checking the cabinets. My hands shook as I carried everything to the car. I could feel the trees watching me, every space between them feeling too dark, too full. I started the engine and drove down the dirt road without looking back at the cabin. When I hit the paved road, I didn't stop. I drove until I saw the town, until I saw people, until I knew I was surrounded by things I could understand again. I checked into a cheap motel and sat on the bed, staring at the wall, trying to slow my breathing. Even now, I think about the prints in the mud, the bare feet by the steps, the sound of someone outside my window at night. I know what I saw. I know someone was out there watching. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I will never go back to a cabin like that again. The silence that I thought I wanted wasn't silence at all. It was someone waiting. I drove up to the cabin late in the afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels heavy and still, and the sky has that dull gray color that makes the trees look darker than they are. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the main road, with a dirt path leading up that seemed almost swallowed by the forest around it. I had rented the place for a week to get away from everything. I wanted quiet, no phones, no noise, just me and the woods. The cabin was small, made of old logs that looked weathered, but it stood solid. The porch was uneven, the boards creaking under my boots as I carried my bags inside. Inside it smelled of wood, dust, and a faint hint of dampness. There was one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen corner, and a separate bedroom at the back. The furniture was old but sturdy, simple things like a heavy wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed. I unloaded my things, checked the cupboards, and found them half-stocked with canned food and a few old pans. The refrigerator hummed faintly when I plugged it in, and the lights flickered before staying steady. There was no phone signal, no television, just the sounds of the forest pressing in through the thin walls. I made a simple meal, sat at the table, and listened. The forest around me was alive, though not loud. I could hear birds somewhere high up, the distant knock of a woodpecker, and now and then the dry rustle of branches as the wind moved through. It was peaceful but carried a weight. Every small sound stood out clear because there was nothing else to drown it. That first night was quiet. I sat by the stove with a lantern and a book, but I kept finding myself staring at the window instead. The cabin sat in a small clearing, and from the window I could see the treeline. It was dark, the kind of dark where the forest looked like a wall. There were no stars, no moon, just black shapes of trees. When I finally went to bed, I noticed how the silence pressed in harder. Lying there, every creak in the woods sounded sharp. The cabin seemed to breathe with me, groaning faintly as the air outside cooled. I had to remind myself this was just how old wood behaved. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I decided to walk the area. The trail I had driven up was rough and narrow, leading back to the road miles away. Around the cabin, the ground was uneven, thick with pine needles, fallen branches, and the roots of trees twisting just under the soil. I followed a faint trail into the woods. It was overgrown, hardly more than a game path, but it led deeper. The woods grew dense fast. The light dimmed under the canopy, and the air felt cooler. I walked for about an hour before I came across something odd. It was a fire pit, old and blackened, with stones stacked in a ring. Around it were pieces of wood that had once been logs for sitting. They were rotting, moss covering them. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. But what struck me was the trash. Empty cans, old wrappers, and a rusted metal pot lay scattered around. Some of it looked recent, like someone had been here not too long ago. I stood there a while, uneasy. There was nothing wrong with someone else camping out here, but the cabin was supposed to be private property. The listing had said no one else used the land. I walked back, uneasy but telling myself it was fine. Maybe some hunters or hikers had passed through. It wasn't unusual. Still, when I got back to the cabin, I checked the locks on the doors and windows, just in case. They were old, but they worked. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest sounded different. Every little sound seemed sharper, closer. Once, in the middle of the night, I woke because I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, like footsteps on dry leaves, slow and dragging. I lay there holding my breath, listening. The sound faded, or maybe it stopped. I waited a long time before sleep came again. The next day, I chopped some wood from the pile stacked at the side of the cabin. I wanted to keep busy, keep my mind from wandering. The sun was out, bright but weak, filtered through the trees. I made breakfast, swept out the cabin, and tried to enjoy the quiet. By afternoon, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the sounds from the night before. Then I found something that unsettled me again. Behind the cabin, about 20 yards into the woods, I noticed a tree with strange marks on it. They were cut into the bark, deep, straight lines, almost like tallies. There were dozens of them, carved crudely with a knife or some sharp tool. They weren't old either. The wood beneath the bark was fresh, pale against the dark surface. I stared at them for a long time, counting. There had to be over 50 marks. Why would someone carve so many into a tree here, of all places? It felt deliberate, like someone had been keeping track of something. I backed away, trying not to let my thoughts spin out. Maybe it was some hunter marking days. Maybe kids messing around. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. That evening, I made sure to bar the door with a chair. I lit only one lantern and kept it low. The cabin seemed smaller with the dark pressing against the windows. Every sound outside felt amplified. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. This time it wasn't faint. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. Slow, careful steps. They circled, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. My chest felt tight, my hands sweating as I sat frozen on the bed. Whoever it was, they didn't try the door, didn't knock, just moved around outside. Then silence. Long silence. I sat there in the dark until the first light crept through the cracks. When I finally opened the door, the clearing was empty. But near the edge of the trees, I saw it. A footprint. Not from boots, but bare feet. The ground was soft enough from yesterday's rain that the print was clear. Toes, heel, everything. Someone had been out there, watching. I felt sick. I thought about leaving, but the car was parked out by the main trail, a good walk from the cabin. If someone was out here, I'd have to pass right through the woods to reach it. The thought of meeting whoever had been walking barefoot at night made me hesitate. I stayed. That day dragged on heavy. I kept checking the windows, jumping at every crack of a branch. I barely ate. I sat with a knife from the kitchen beside me, though I knew it wouldn't help much. When night came again, I almost couldn't bear it. I sat in the dark, heart pounding, listening. Hours passed before I heard it again. Steps closer this time. The boards of the porch groaned under weight. Whoever it was, they were right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting for the knock, for the handle to turn. But nothing came. The steps moved slowly across the porch, then down. After a while, silence returned. In the morning, I checked the porch. Dirt smeared across the boards. And another footprint. Bare, narrow, toes spread. It had stood right at the door. That broke something in me. I packed my things, stuffing them into my bag with shaking hands. I couldn't stay. Whatever or whoever was out there wasn't going to leave me alone. I took the path toward the car. The forest felt alive, watching me. Every shadow seemed deeper, every branch like a hand reaching out. I moved fast, stumbling over roots, eyes darting around. Halfway there, I stopped cold. On the path ahead lay something small, a can from the cabin pantry, one I hadn't touched. It sat right in the middle of the trail as if placed there. I didn't pick it up. I stepped around it, heart pounding harder, and kept moving. When I reached the car, I found the driver's side door open. I knew I had shut it. Inside, the seat was smeared with dirt, and on the dash, scratched faintly into the dust, were more tallies. Dozens of them. My hands shook as I started the car. I didn't look back at the cabin, didn't look into the trees. I drove until the road widened and the forest thinned, not stopping until I saw another car on the highway. I didn't go back. I didn't call anyone about it. I just left it behind, though even now, I can still see those tallies cut into the tree, into my car's dash. And I can still hear the sound of those slow, bare footsteps circling the cabin in the dark. I had been looking forward to a quiet week in the small cabin for months. I had found it online, tucked far into the woods by a lake, and it seemed like the perfect place to clear my head and spend some time away from the noise of everything. I packed enough food for the week, a few changes of clothes, some books, and basic camping gear in case anything went wrong. I thought of it as an escape, something I needed after months of long hours at work and not much time for myself. The drive out there took most of the day. The further I went, the thinner the traffic got, until the paved road turned into gravel, then narrowed into a dirt path lined with thick trees. The air felt different as I got deeper into the woods. It was heavier, quieter, and it carried that smell of pine, soil, and damp moss that only comes when you are really far from towns and roads. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already leaning low, painting the tops of the trees orange. The cabin itself was small, one story, built out of rough logs with a tin roof. There was a porch with a couple of chairs, a door that looked a little too thin for comfort, and windows on the front and sides. Around the cabin was nothing but trees and more trees, and about 50 yards away, down a slope, I could see the lake, flat and still, reflecting the last light of the sky. There was no one else around for miles. I knew that because on the way in, I had passed no other houses. Inside, the cabin was as simple as it looked in the pictures. A single room with a bed pushed against one wall, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood stove for heat. There was a small bathroom in the back with a pump toilet and a bucket shower setup, nothing fancy. The place smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it was clean enough. The first night was quiet. I ate a quick meal, sat on the porch as it got darker, and listened to the forest. The sounds carried differently out here. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every bird call stood out. There was no background hum of traffic or people, just silence and nature. It was peaceful, but it also felt heavy, like the woods pressed in on the cabin from all sides. When it got fully dark, I went back inside, lit a lantern, read for a while, and went to bed. The first few days went the way I expected. I woke up early with the sunlight, made coffee, and walked down to the lake. The water was cold and clear, and sometimes I would see fish ripple the surface. I spent hours reading on the porch, walking along faint trails that led deeper into the woods, and chopping some firewood stacked by the cabin. The weather was steady, warm during the day, cooler at night. I felt cut off from everything, and it was exactly what I thought I wanted. But then the small things began. It started with sounds at night. The cabin was old and it creaked, so at first, I thought it was just the wood shifting in the cool air. But sometimes it was different. I would wake up to the sound of something brushing against the wall outside, slow and deliberate, a dragging sound. Other times it was a sharp crack like a branch snapping close by. Once I swore I heard something tap against the window glass, but when I sat up in bed and looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear passing by. The cabin was out here in their territory, after all. Still, I started keeping the lantern lit longer at night, and I checked the locks on the door and windows more than once before bed. The thin door and single latch did not make me feel secure, but it was all I had. On the fourth day, I noticed footprints by the lake. They were in the mud, near where I usually stood in the mornings. They weren't mine, at least not all of them. They were larger, heavier, pressed deeper. At first, I thought maybe hunters or hikers had passed by, but the tracks were fresh, and I hadn't heard a boat or seen anyone else since I got there. The prints led away into the trees, but they didn't follow a trail. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up in bed. I thought I heard something moving around the porch, the soft scrape of boots on the wooden boards. I held my breath and listened, but the noise would stop whenever I was sure of it. When I finally got up the courage to peek through the curtain, the porch was empty, lit faintly by moonlight. I stayed awake until morning, sitting at the table with the lantern burning low. The next day, I decided to check the area more carefully. I walked along the edge of the cabin, down the slope to the lake, and back through the trees in a wide circle. I didn't see anyone, but I found more signs. Broken branches at shoulder height, as if someone had pushed through roughly. A cigarette, but half buried in the dirt near the path I had taken from the road. I didn't smoke, and it didn't look old. That changed everything. Up until then, I had been telling myself it was just animals or my imagination, but finding that cigarette but meant someone else had been out here, close to the cabin, watching or passing through. The nearest town was miles away. There was no reason for someone to be walking around out here, not unless they were camping or hunting. But I had not seen a campsite, no blaze on the trees, no gear, nothing. I spent the afternoon inside, keeping the door locked, and only going out once to grab more wood for the stove. I tried to read but couldn't focus. Every creak made me tense. I found myself looking at the thin curtains on the windows and how easy it would be for someone outside to just stand there and watch me without me knowing. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of the porch steps groaning. Slow, heavy, one after another. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe quietly. The steps stopped near the door. Then I heard the faint rattle of the latch, like someone testing it. Gently, carefully. I didn't have a gun, only a hatchet I had been using for wood. I gripped it tight under the blanket, waiting, but after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The steps creaked again, moving away. I waited, staring at the door, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were muddy boot prints on the boards. Big ones. They came up the steps, stopped at the door, then turned and left. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, shoving my clothes into the bag, stuffing the food I had left into a box. I kept looking at the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back. When I carried my things to the car, I felt exposed, like someone was watching from the trees. I kept the hatchet in my hand until I got the last of my bags loaded. The drive back down the dirt road was tense. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone standing there. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half convinced I would see a truck following me. But the road stayed empty. It wasn't until I hit the first stretch of paved road that I let myself breathe. By the time I reached town, I was exhausted. I stopped at a gas station, sat in the car for a long time, and thought about what had happened. I considered telling someone, maybe the sheriff, but what could I say? That I had heard noises, seen footprints, found a cigarette butt? That someone had rattled my cabin door at night? None of it proved anything. It would just sound like I had gotten scared being alone in the woods. But I knew what I felt out there. Someone had been near that cabin. Someone had walked around it at night, had tried the door, and had stood close enough to leave boot prints on the porch. I didn't know who or why, and maybe I never would, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never go back there again. I had been planning the trip for weeks before I finally set out. The idea was simple enough. I wanted a few days away from everything, away from noise, away from work, away from the endless ringing of my phone. I rented a small cabin far out in the woods, one of those old log structures people sometimes list online for cheap. It had no internet, no phone signal, and no electricity beyond a small generator that was only meant to be used when necessary. It seemed like the perfect place to be left alone. The cabin was about a 40-minute drive from the nearest paved road. Getting there required steering through dirt tracks filled with rocks, potholes, and sections where branches scraped along the sides of my truck. By the time I arrived, my shoulders were tight from gripping the steering wheel, and the air outside had turned cool. The cabin sat low in a clearing surrounded by thick trees. The wood was dark and weathered, and the roof sagged a little, but it looked solid enough to last me the week. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust. The air was heavier than I expected, as though it had been closed up for months. There was a single main room with a bed pushed into one corner, a table in the middle, and a small wood stove set against the wall. The floorboards creaked under my boots. The windows had old glass panes, and when I opened one, the hinges groaned like something alive. It wasn't fancy, but I hadn't come here for comfort. I wanted quiet. I unloaded my truck, carried in my cooler, my backpack, a box of food, and a few tools I thought I might need. I made a mental note that I should chop some firewood before it got dark. The sun had already started dipping low behind the trees, and the clearing was beginning to fall into shadow. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. When I killed the generator and the small light went out, I was left in a silence so deep I could hear the faint ringing inside my ears. Lying on the bed, I kept shifting, adjusting the blanket, and listening. I thought I would enjoy silence, but there was something unnatural about it. At home, there was always the sound of cars in the distance, or the buzz of appliances, or voices through the wall. Here, there was nothing but the occasional pop from the wood stove. At some point, I fell asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the cabin was pitch black. The stove had gone cold, and the air felt sharp. I stayed very still because I thought I heard something outside. A crunch, like a boot on dry leaves. I held my breath and listened. A second crunch followed, then nothing. I waited for what felt like an hour, every muscle tense, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, I pulled the blanket tight around me and forced myself to sleep again. The next morning, I went outside and walked the edge of the clearing. The leaves were scattered, and there were marks where deer had passed, but I couldn't find anything that looked like a boot print. Maybe I imagined it, or maybe it had been an animal heavier than the rest. I shook it off and got back to work. The day was long and slow. I split some logs and stacked them by the cabin wall. I boiled water over the stove and made coffee that tasted like ash but felt warm in my hands. I tried to sit on the steps and read a book I had brought, but my eyes kept lifting toward the trees. Every time the wind moved through them, I felt as if something was shifting just out of sight. That night, I decided to leave the lantern on. I didn't want to be caught in complete darkness again. I was halfway between sleep and waking when I heard the sound again. This time, it was not just one crunch, but a series of them. They came slow, dragging through the leaves, circling around the side of the cabin. I froze in bed. My body refused to move. My throat was dry, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it shook the mattress. The sound stopped near the back wall. I waited. The silence pressed down on me. Then, very faintly, I heard what I can only describe as breathing. It wasn't my own. It was outside the wall, slow, heavy, and steady, like someone was standing just beyond the logs. I stayed awake for hours, too afraid to check, too afraid to make a sound. When the first gray light of morning filtered in through the window, the sound was gone. I stepped outside as soon as I had the nerve. The ground was damp from the night air. First, I saw nothing unusual. Then, near the back wall, I found something. It was faint, but there in the soil was a mark that looked like the front half of a shoe print. The rest of it was smudged, as if whoever left it had twisted their foot as they turned away. I felt a cold rush in my chest. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. No one was supposed to be out here. I didn't know if it was some hunter passing through or someone who had been watching me. But either way, the idea of a stranger so close unsettled me more than I can explain. The next day dragged. Couldn't relax. I kept stepping outside, walking circles around the clearing, scanning the tree line. I listened for branches snapping, for anything unusual. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My hands trembled when I tried to eat. That night, I loaded my rifle and set it by the bed. I lay awake, listening. Hours passed before the noise came again. This time it was different. It wasn't slow and cautious. It was sudden, heavy, quick steps rushing across the leaves, coming straight toward the cabin. I shot up in bed, grabbed the rifle, and held my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside the front wall. I could hear the wood creak, as though someone had placed their hand against it. I aimed the rifle at the door, my fingers shaking on the trigger, and waited. Nothing happened. Minutes turned to an hour. The silence returned. Eventually, exhaustion forced my body down, though I don't know if I truly slept. By morning, I found more prints, clearer this time. They were from boots. The size looked like a man's. They led from the trees to the cabin and then disappeared back into the woods. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but when I checked my truck, I froze. The gas cap was missing. Not the whole cap, but the little plastic flap had been pried off, and the smell of gasoline hung in the air. I checked the tank. Almost all of it was gone. Whoever was out there had siphoned it during the night. I felt my stomach drop. I was stuck. The days that followed bled into each other. I rationed my food more carefully, knowing I might be here longer than I planned. I kept the rifle close at all times. During the day, I searched for signs in the woods, but the deeper I went, the more I realized how hopeless it was. There were too many leaves, too many paths. I could walk for hours and see nothing. The nights were worse. Whoever it was, they never tried the door. They never smashed a window. They just circled, dragging footsteps around the cabin, sometimes stopping for long stretches, sometimes moving quickly. I would hear breathing again, or the scrape of something metallic against the logs. Each night, I felt my nerves tear thinner and thinner. On the fifth night, the generator failed. I tried to start it, but it coughed and died. I had no light anymore, just the dark and the small flame of the wood stove. The cabin felt smaller than ever. Every crack in the wood, every groan of the walls, felt amplified. The sixth night, I heard them on the roof. Slow steps above me, shifting the weight of shingles, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. I sat frozen on the bed, staring at the ceiling, afraid that at any moment they might crash through. But they didn't. They just paced and then climbed down again. By the seventh day, I was half delirious from lack of sleep. My eyes burned, and my chest felt tight all the time. I ate only when I could force it down. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. That afternoon, I heard something new, the faint rumble of an engine. My head snapped up and I ran outside. A truck was coming down the dirt track. For a moment, I thought it might be whoever had been tormenting me, but when it came closer, I saw a Forestry Service logo on the door. Two men stepped out wearing uniforms. They said they had come to check the area for fire risks. Relief washed over me so hard I nearly collapsed. I didn't tell them everything, just enough. I said someone had been around my cabin at night, and I thought they had siphoned my gas. The men exchanged a look, then nodded. They gave me enough fuel to get back to the paved road and advised me to leave sooner rather than later. I didn't argue. I packed what I could in minutes and threw everything else into the truck bed. I didn't even look back at the cabin as I drove off. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles were white, and my eyes stayed fixed on the road until I finally saw asphalt again. Even now, sitting at home, I can still hear it if I close my eyes. The crunch of leaves, the slow breathing, the scrape against the logs. Whoever was out there never tried to kill me, never even tried to break inside. They just watched. They waited. And I don't know what would have happened if those men hadn't arrived when they did. That cabin is still out there, standing alone in the woods, but I know I'll never go back. I drove out to the mountains with the idea of spending a few days alone in a rented cabin. The plan was simple. I wanted to take a break from my daily life, from work, from the constant noise of the city, from the pressure of being around people all the time. I had looked online for remote cabins that could be rented out, and I found one that seemed perfect. It sat far away from the main road, surrounded by trees, with no neighbors close by. The pictures showed a wooden structure with a small porch, a stone chimney, and a clearing around it where grass and weeds grew unevenly. It was advertised as a secluded retreat, and that was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long. I left the highway and took smaller and smaller roads until the pavement ended, and I was driving on dirt and gravel. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No houses, no gas stations, no stores. Just stretches of forest, tall trees closing in from both sides, and the occasional deer darting across the road. My phone signal dropped as soon as I passed a certain ridge. From that point on, I knew I was cut off from contact. That part didn't bother me much at first. I thought it would be nice to be unreachable, to feel completely away from everything. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures, but there was something about seeing it in person that made it feel different. It sat in the clearing with its windows dark, the wood weathered and gray from years of exposure to rain and snow. The roof sagged a little, but not enough to suggest it was unsafe. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it, and I noticed how quiet everything was. The forest around me didn't make the usual lively noises I expected. No birdsong, no rustling from small animals. Just a stillness that felt too heavy for daytime. I unlocked the cabin with the key that had been left for me in a lockbox. Inside, it smelled like wood, dust, and something faintly damp, like the air in an old basement. The furniture was simple. A small table with 2 chairs, a couch with worn cushions, a stone fireplace, and a bed in the corner with a heavy blanket folded on top. There was no electricity. Light came from kerosene lamps placed on shelves, and heat had to come from the fireplace or a small wood stove. A cooler box sat in the kitchen area where food could be stored with ice packs. Everything was basic, but I expected that. I unpacked my things slowly, taking time to put food in the cooler, clothes in a bag by the bed, and my flashlight and batteries on the table. The air inside felt cooler than outside, and I thought about starting a fire, but I decided to wait until later. For a while, I just sat on the porch, looking at the trees. The afternoon sun filtered through them in uneven patches, and the shadows stretched longer as the hours passed. That first night, I noticed how different darkness felt out there. In the city, darkness was never complete. There were always lights somewhere. Street lights, headlights, neon signs. But here, once the sun went down, there was nothing but blackness pressing in from every direction. When I turned off my lamp, I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. The sounds of the forest became clearer. Branches cracked in the distance. Leaves rustled. Something padded through the underbrush. Every noise felt amplified in the silence. I slept poorly, Every time I started to drift off, I would hear a sound that jolted me awake. At one point, I heard something brush against the side of the cabin, a dragging sound along the wooden wall, slow and deliberate. I froze in bed, my ears straining, waiting to hear if it came back. It didn't, but the unease it left behind stayed with me until morning. The second day, I tried to distract myself with small tasks. I gathered wood for the stove, walked along a narrow trail behind the cabin, and sat on the porch again to drink from a water bottle I had brought. But something always felt off. The forest still seemed too quiet. I rarely saw birds, and the air carried a strange heaviness, as if the place was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the memory of the dragging sound on the wall from the night before. That night, things escalated. I went to bed early, hoping exhaustion would make me sleep better. Instead, I woke up around midnight to the sound of footsteps outside. They were slow, crunching on the grass around the cabin. I held my breath, listening, counting each step. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing now and then moving again. At one point, they came right up to the porch. I could hear the wooden steps creak under weight. My body went rigid with fear. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, fading back into the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for them to return. By the third day, fear had settled into me like a weight I couldn't shake. I started noticing small things that made me feel watched. A footprint in the dirt near the porch that didn't belong to me. A branch broken at an odd angle, as if someone had stepped on it deliberately. A faint smudge on the window glass, the shape of a handprint. That night, the sounds came again, but louder, closer, more insistent. Something rattled the doorknob. Something pressed against the window. The walls creaked as if weight was leaning against them. I sat in bed gripping a heavy flashlight like a weapon, my heart racing so hard I thought it would burst. The cabin that had once felt like a retreat now felt like a trap. When morning finally came, I decided I couldn't stay another night. The fear had grown too strong. I packed my bag quickly, stuffing clothes and food back into it, and stepped outside to head toward my car. That's when I saw it. On the ground, in the dirt beside the porch, was a fresh footprint. It was large, made by a boot, and it pointed directly toward the cabin. Next to it was another, and another, forming a clear trail leading into the trees. My stomach turned cold as I realized what it meant. Someone had been here, circling the cabin at night, leaving marks I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't waste time. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove as fast as the narrow dirt road would allow. My hands gripped the wheel tight, my eyes darting to the mirrors, half expecting to see someone following me. The further I got from the cabin, the easier it became to breathe. By the time I reached the main road, my nerves were shot. My body felt drained, my mind heavy with the memory of those nights. I didn't stop until I reached a town with people, lights, and noise. The safety of numbers felt overwhelming after the isolation I had just endured. Looking back, the scariest part was not knowing who had been out there or what they wanted. It could have been someone living off the land, someone disturbed, someone looking for an easy target. I'll never know. All I know is that I wasn't alone in those woods, no matter how quiet they seemed. The cabin had been advertised as a retreat, a place to escape, but for me, it became a place of fear. I learned that isolation can strip away the comfort of safety and leave you exposed. Out there, surrounded by miles of forest and silence, the line between peace and danger was thinner than I ever imagined. When I got home, I deleted the listing from my computer and never looked at cabins again. The idea of seclusion no longer appealed to me. I had seen what it felt like to be watched with no one around to help, and I knew I would never willingly put myself in that position again. The cabin was supposed to give me rest, but instead, it gave me the sharpest fear I had ever felt, the kind that lingers long after you've left the place behind. I had been planning a short break for weeks. Life in the city had drained me, and I wanted somewhere far away, somewhere quiet, somewhere that felt disconnected from the constant noise of cars, people, and buildings pressing up against each other. I searched online for rentals and found a cabin sitting alone in the woods, several hours from where I lived. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure with a small porch, a chimney, and a gravel driveway surrounded by endless trees. There was no mention of neighbors close by, which made it even more appealing. I booked it without overthinking. The drive out there was long but calm. Once I left the highway, the back roads grew narrow, twisting deeper into thick forest. I kept checking my phone signal as the bars dropped lower and lower until they disappeared completely. The GPS worked for a while but then froze, so I relied on the printed directions I had thought to bring just in case. The sun was low by the time I pulled up to the cabin. It stood exactly as shown in the photos. A dark brown structure with a pitched roof, a small porch with 2 old chairs, and 1 dim lantern by the door. When I stepped out of the car, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No cars, no hum of distant highways, no human activity at all. Just the occasional rustle of wind through leaves and a bird calling somewhere far off. It was the kind of silence that almost felt too heavy, like it pressed down on me. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood and dust. It wasn't dirty, but it had that unused feel, like it hadn't been lived in for weeks. There was one main room with a small kitchen in the corner, a couch, and a fireplace. A door led to a small bedroom with a single bed, and another door opened to a bathroom with old but working plumbing. It was simple, almost too simple, but I told myself that was the whole point. I unpacked a few things, lit the fireplace, and settled in. My plan was to read, write in a notebook I brought, maybe take some walks and just let my mind clear. That first evening passed quietly. I made a basic meal, drank some coffee, and sat on the porch until the cold drove me back inside. The woods grew very dark, the kind of darkness where you couldn't see more than a few feet past the porch. I went to bed early, and the night was uneventful. The second day, I woke to sunlight coming through the curtains. I spent the morning walking around the area, following what looked like deer trails. The forest was dense but beautiful. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were from nature itself. I felt relaxed in a way I hadn't for a long time. When I got back, I ate and sat outside with my notebook, jotting down random thoughts. The hours slipped by without me noticing, but that night things changed. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something. At first I thought it was wind, but then it sounded more like steps. Slow, deliberate steps on gravel. My car sat only a few feet from the cabin, and the porch had a small gravel path leading to it. My heart beat harder as I lay still, straining to listen. The steps stopped. Then I heard nothing for a long stretch. I convinced myself it must have been an animal. Deer, raccoon, anything. I eventually drifted back to sleep, though it wasn't as easy as before. The next morning, I went outside to look. The gravel path showed faint signs of disturbance, but I couldn't tell if it was new. I walked around, checked near the car, and even scanned the tree line. Everything looked normal. I shook it off and told myself I was just not used to being alone in such silence, which made every sound seem bigger than it was. That day, I tried to distract myself with hiking. I followed a longer trail that wound uphill, giving me a view of endless trees stretching for miles. I didn't see a single person the whole time. When I returned in the afternoon, I felt tired but calmer. That night, though, the sound returned. This time it was clearer. Gravel crunching, closer, then stopping. My body froze in bed. I didn't move a muscle, breathing shallow. After several minutes of silence, I heard something faintly scrape against the porch railing. Not loud, but just enough to make my skin crawl. Then silence again. I barely slept. In the morning, I checked the porch. The railing had a thin streak of dirt smudged across it, like something brushed by. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear sniffing around. But the sound of steps was too steady for that. The third night was worse. I was again in bed, tense, waiting. Around midnight, I heard the steps. This time, they circled the cabin. Gravel, then leaves crunching, then silence. My throat was dry, and my whole body felt tight. I kept glancing at the window, which had thin curtains that barely covered it. The thought of someone standing out there, watching, made my stomach twist. The steps stopped behind the cabin. I waited. Then came a sound that made my chest clench. The back doorknob rattling. Slowly, lightly, as if someone was testing it. My breath caught, and I gripped the blanket tight, staring at the bedroom door. The rattling stopped after a few seconds. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I was a mess. My head pounded. My body ached from tension, and I kept checking outside like I expected to see someone. The back door showed no damage, no scratches, no forced marks. But I knew what I heard. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear without proof. Plus, I was hours from home with no phone signal, and driving tired didn't feel safe. I told myself I would stay one more night, but if anything happened again, I would pack up and leave immediately in the morning. That day dragged on. Every little sound in the woods set me on edge. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. All of it made me glance up sharply. I sat outside for a while but couldn't relax, so I stayed in the cabin with the door locked. When darkness came, I felt trapped. I lit the fireplace but kept the lights dim, thinking maybe if someone was out there, they wouldn't notice as easily. I sat on the couch, fully awake, listening. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Then, near 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Gravel crunching, slow and careful. This time I didn't stay in bed. I stood in the dark living room, my body tense, heart racing. The steps came closer until they reached the porch. The wooden boards creaked. I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. Instead, a shadow moved past the window. A human shadow, tall, clear, walking slowly along the porch. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. The shadow stopped by the window, right where the curtain was thinnest. I stayed completely still, praying they couldn't see inside. After a long pause, the shadow moved on. The boards creaked again, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed everything in a rush, throwing my things into the bag without care. I didn't even make breakfast. I got in the car, started it, and drove down the gravel driveway as fast as I could. My hands shook on the wheel, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop. I drove straight until I saw the first sign of a gas station nearly an hour later. I pulled in and sat in the car, hands gripping the wheel, finally letting myself breathe. I don't know who was out there those nights. Maybe someone living in the woods, maybe a drifter, maybe someone who knew that cabin was often empty and liked to scare visitors. I'll never know, but I do know I wasn't imagining it. The steps, the rattling, the shadow, those were real. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even leave a review on the rental site because I didn't want to think about it again. But sometimes, at night, when things are too quiet, I remember the sound of those footsteps circling in the dark, and I wonder how close I came to something far worse. I had been waiting for this trip for months. Life in the city had become loud, heavy, and draining, and I wanted a place where I could shut everything out. The cabin had been sitting in my head for weeks, ever since I came across its listing in a quiet rental page online. It was a small place, set deep in a valley where few people ever went. The description said it had no neighbors within several miles, no phone service, and only one narrow dirt road leading in. That was exactly what I wanted. No noise, no distractions, no one to bother me. The drive took most of the day. The last hour was the hardest because the road grew thinner, rougher, with thick trees pressing in on both sides. Branches scraped along my car, and rocks crunched under the tires. It felt like I was being pulled into another world, one where people didn't belong anymore. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin sat waiting at the edge of a wide slope of trees. It was small, one floor, made of dark logs that looked aged but solid. A chimney leaned slightly on one side, and the roof looked patched in a few places. The silence around it was heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I parked, got out, and carried my bags inside. The cabin was as simple as I expected. A main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen with an old fridge, one bedroom with a narrow bed, and a bathroom with a pump sink. The windows were small, with wooden shutters. Dust floated in the air where the sunlight cut through, and the smell of wood and damp stone hung everywhere. I checked the fridge, relieved to find it worked on propane, and put in the food I had brought. The first hours felt perfect. I walked around outside, listening to the quiet. There were no faraway sounds of highways, no planes overhead, no voices, just the whisper of trees and the distant creak of branches rubbing in the wind. I stacked firewood beside the stove and set up my sleeping bag on top of the bed. I kept thinking this was exactly what I needed. That night, I cooked pasta on the small propane stove and ate while sitting by the window. The forest grew darker than anything I had seen before. When the sun dropped, the trees turned black, and the shadows swallowed every bit of space beyond the clearing. I thought it would bother me, but it didn't, at least not then. The first strange thing happened that night when I was lying in bed. The cabin was quiet except for the stove ticking as it cooled down. Then I heard a crack outside, sharp, like a branch snapping under weight. I froze. My first thought was deer, but then there was another crack, closer, and then a slow dragging sound across the ground. It stopped near the wall where the bedroom window was. I lay still, holding my breath, staring at the ceiling. I told myself it was an animal. The woods were full of them, and many moved at night. I thought maybe it was a bear, maybe just sniffing around, but the dragging sound didn't move away. It stayed there for a long while, and I imagined something large pressing close to the wall. I couldn't see through the shuttered window, so I had nothing to confirm. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the sound moved slowly away, back into the woods. I stayed awake long after, listening, until exhaustion finally forced me to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. I expected to see tracks or something that proved my guess. The dirt around the cabin showed faint depressions, but they didn't look like hooves. They were long, flat patches like someone dragging heavy boots. I knelt down, staring at them, but the shapes weren't clear. They led out toward the trees, disappearing into leaves. I told myself again it was nothing. Maybe fallen branches being dragged by animals, or maybe my mind made the noise sound more human than it really was. I tried to push it away. I spent the day reading, chopping some extra wood, and walking along the slope down toward a creek that ran at the bottom of the valley. The water there was cold and fast, running between smooth stones. The sun on the water felt almost too bright, and for a while I let myself relax again. But that night, it happened again. It started with the same sharp snap, like weight breaking a stick. Then came the slow steps through the leaves. I lay in bed, every muscle tense, listening. The sound circled the cabin this time, slow and steady, like someone walking deliberately around, stopping, then moving again. I gripped the blanket tight and stared at the window. My chest felt like it would burst from the way I was holding my breath. After circling, the sound stopped near the door. There was no knock, no attempt to come in, just silence. Then a scrape, like something rough brushing against the wood of the cabin. My mind raced with every explanation. Person, but who would walk miles into the woods to a hidden cabin at night? An animal? But why did it sound so slow, deliberate, and steady? I lay there until the sound faded. Again, when I finally fell asleep, it was from pure exhaustion. In the morning, I checked again. This time, I saw clearer marks near the door. They looked like scuffs, too narrow for an animal, too even, like shoe marks, but they were smeared, dragged, as if someone walked without lifting their feet properly. The dirt carried faint streaks leading back toward the trees. A deep unease settled in me, but I told myself not to panic. I had food, water, a locked door, and no one knew I was here. I thought that meant I was safe. I kept telling myself that. The third night was worse. The noises started earlier, before I had even fallen asleep. I was sitting by the stove, staring at the flames, when I heard it. Slow, crunching footsteps, not on all fours, but upright, moving across the clearing. I felt my skin crawl as I realized the sound was too controlled to be an animal. I blew out the lantern and sat in darkness, waiting. The steps came closer, then paused. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would echo. I waited for the sound to move again, but instead, something brushed lightly against the window shutters. A faint scrape, like fingers sliding across wood. I sat frozen in the dark for hours, every nerve alive with fear. When the sound finally faded, I didn't sleep. By morning, I had made a decision. I would leave. I told myself I had come here for peace, but this wasn't peace anymore. Something was out there, and I couldn't explain it, but I knew it wasn't right. I started packing my things, shoving clothes into my bag, moving fast, almost frantic. When I stepped outside to load the car, I froze. Across the dirt clearing, near the line of trees, there were deep scuff marks, dozens of them, leading out of the forest and stopping in random spots around the cabin. They weren't prints like a normal walk. They looked as though someone had dragged their feet in circles over and over, stopping and starting again. Some came within a few feet of the cabin walls. My stomach twisted at the sight. I rushed to the car, tossing my bag inside, and turned the key. The engine coughed, then died. I tried again, panic rising in my throat, but it wouldn't turn over. I slammed my fists against the wheel, realizing I wasn't leaving yet. The rest of the day was long and silent. I checked the hood, but I didn't know enough about engines to fix anything. The only road out was miles long, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to hike it with my bag. Still, I considered it. I thought about waiting until morning and trying. That night sealed it. The sounds came back, louder, closer, more certain. The slow, dragging steps circled again, but this time they didn't fade. They stayed. I heard them cross the porch. The wood creaked under weight. My breath caught as something pressed against the door. A slow pressure, like testing it. The latch held, but I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, gripping a piece of firewood like a weapon. Hours passed, the sounds shifting, scraping, dragging, circling. I knew then it wasn't going to stop. By morning, I was shaking from lack of sleep and fear. I made the choice. I packed only what I could carry: water, food, a jacket, and left the rest. I locked the cabin behind me, though I knew it didn't matter, and started walking the road out. The forest was heavy around me, each sound sharp in the silence. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone on the road behind me, dragging their feet, following. But the road stayed empty. Hours passed as I walked. My legs ached, my throat dried, and my nerves screamed at every rustle in the trees. I pushed forward, one step after another, desperate to see anything that looked like a sign of people. When I finally reached the edge where the dirt road met the first stretch of paved road, I collapsed to my knees. The sight of the cracked asphalt felt like safety. I stayed there, breathing hard, before forcing myself to keep walking. A few miles later, I found a small ranger station. It looked empty at first, but I banged on the door until someone stepped out. I didn't tell them everything. I only said my car had broken down and I had to walk out. They gave me water and helped me call for a tow. I never mentioned the sounds, the dragging steps, or the marks around the cabin. I had gone up to the cabin thinking I needed space, a quiet place where nothing would reach me. Not the noise of town, not the stress of people, not even the hum of traffic. The cabin was old, small, and tucked into the thick tree line of a forest that pressed close on all sides. The roof sagged a little on one corner, the windows were streaked with old dust and rain stains, and the porch creaked under my boots the moment I stepped onto it. Still, the place gave me a sense of being away, cut off in a way that I thought would feel refreshing. First, it did. The first few hours were easy. I swept the inside, set my bag in the corner, and stacked the firewood that had been left leaning against the back wall. The air smelled sharp and cold even though it was late summer. The forest outside carried that mix of pine and damp earth that always seemed heavier when no wind moved the branches. By evening, I had already grown used to the sound of the insects that seemed to hum and buzz from every direction, a steady wall of sound that filled every pause. I cooked something simple on the small propane stove I had brought, ate it slowly in the half-light, then sat in the wooden chair by the window with my arms crossed, listening to the forest settle into night. It was when the dark fell that the quiet took on another shape. Out there, the world did not empty itself of sound. It only traded one layer for another. The insects dulled a little, replaced by the occasional faraway crack of a branch, or the flutter of wings too quick to follow. It felt heavier. The trees outside the window pressed in close, their shadows mixing together until they looked like one long wall of black that circled the cabin. I reminded myself it was just how night in the forest worked. Still, I checked the door twice before lying down on the thin mattress against the wall. That first night, I barely slept. I lay with my eyes half open, the mattress too thin and uneven beneath me, listening for anything that sounded like it was coming too close. Every time I felt I might sink into sleep, another sound reached me. A sharp thud against the porch. A rustle that went on longer than the usual wind could cause. A hollow echo, as if something had shifted weight against the outer wall. My pulse quickened each time, but I told myself it was animals. Raccoons, deer, maybe even just a branch sliding loose. By dawn, I was still awake, my eyes burning and heavy, but I forced myself to get up anyway, telling myself it was nothing. The day felt easier. I stepped outside, stretched my arms, and looked around. The trees stood close, tall, and still. No wind moved them. Their needles and leaves seemed to form a ceiling that swallowed most of the sky. The ground carried prints here and there. Animal tracks, lines where something had dragged across the soil, patches where grass had been pressed flat. I avoided looking at them too long. I walked the perimeter of the cabin instead, checking the walls, the windows, the roof. Everything was in place. Nothing had been broken or moved. That gave me a kind of comfort I needed badly after the night. I spent the day stacking wood properly, filling water bottles from the creek a little ways downhill, and trying to rest. I sat on the porch for hours, watching how the light shifted between the branches. By afternoon, though, a feeling I couldn't shake settled on me. It was as if the trees themselves leaned closer than they had that morning. It felt like being watched, though I told myself that was just the lack of human presence making me sensitive. The quiet didn't soothe me anymore, pressed too close. By the time night returned, I was already tense. I cooked again, ate quickly, and sat in silence as the shadows gathered. The same sounds came back, dull thuds, cracks in the undergrowth, rustling that seemed too deliberate. I froze more than once, my fork held halfway to my mouth, listening hard. Then it came, louder than before, a heavy step on the porch. I held my breath, staring at the door. The wood creaked under the weight of something. Then nothing, just silence, stretched so long that it made my ears ring. I forced myself to stay in the chair until my body ached from the stiffness. Eventually, I crawled into bed again, pulled the blanket to my chin, and lay awake through the long hours until a pale light bled into the cabin. On the third day, I thought about leaving. My truck was parked at the end of the dirt path, half a mile down the slope. I could pack my bag, walk to it, and drive away. But something stubborn in me held back. I didn't want to feel like I had run from nothing more than a few night sounds. I told myself I'd last at least a week. The cabin was solid. The door had a lock. I had supplies. If I ignored the tension in my chest, I could almost believe everything was normal. Still, I noticed more during the daylight now. A footprint by the porch that was too large and too heavy to be a deer. A broken branch higher than any animal would reach. A faint scrape on the cabin's back wall, long and narrow, like something dragged against it. My stomach knotted each time I saw them, but I kept myself busy with chores, pushing away the thoughts that wanted to grow. I carried more wood inside. I cleaned the inside again, though it was already clean. Anything to keep moving. That night, the sounds started earlier, just after dusk. Before the sky had even turned completely dark, something brushed against the far wall of the cabin. I froze, the hairs on my arms lifting. Then another sound, like fingernails scraping wood, traced along the back corner. My breathing turned shallow. I tried to tell myself again that it was animals, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The weight of the steps, the way the boards gave beneath them, the pattern of movement, it wasn't random. It was slow, testing, circling. I sat in the chair all night with my back to the wall, staring at the door. Every few minutes a new sound came, the creak of the porch, the faint tap at the window glass, so light it might have been nothing if not for how steady it came, as if done on purpose. Once, something heavy pressed against the door, making it groan under the pressure. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would give me away, even though I knew I wasn't the one being hidden from. When dawn finally arrived, I was shaking from exhaustion. The fourth day, I didn't step outside. I stayed inside with the curtains drawn, sitting in silence, my ears straining for anything. I didn't eat much. I drank water and forced down a few bites of food, but my stomach felt too tight for more. When night came, I was already worn down, nerves shot from the constant waiting. The noises came again, louder, closer. This time the door handle rattled once, sharp and fast. I nearly fell out of the chair, every muscle locking in place. Whoever or whatever it was didn't try again, but the message was clear. By morning, I knew I couldn't last much longer. I needed to leave. The plan formed in pieces. I would wait for daylight, gather only what I could carry quickly, and get to the truck. I repeated it in my head until it felt like the only option left. But the fifth day brought a new weight with it. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the trees, and saw something that froze me in place. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of trees, the grass was pressed down in a perfect oval, as if something or someone had stood there for a long time. Watching, my throat went dry. I turned, went back inside, and locked the door. I knew then the decision wasn't mine anymore. Leaving wasn't just smart. It was the only way. That night was the longest. Every sound was sharper, closer. The porch boards whined again and again under the pressure of steps. The door creaked as if weight leaned against it. A slow drag moved across the wall, up and down, steady. My chest felt tight enough to burst. I didn't sleep, didn't move, just sat with my back to the wall, staring at the door until the first light came through the cracks in the curtains. The sixth morning, I acted fast. I stuffed my bag with only the essentials: water, some food, a flashlight. I left everything else behind. My hands shook as I checked the lock once more, though I knew it wouldn't matter. Then I stepped out onto the porch, the boards groaning under my own weight. The clearing looked empty. The trees stood still, but I felt eyes on me, stronger than ever. I forced myself to move one step after another down the narrow path. My breath came shallow and fast. Every crack of a branch behind me made me turn my head, but the trees looked the same each time. Still, I knew I wasn't alone. My body felt it in a way that didn't need proof. The half-mile stretched forever. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the truck, relief hit me so hard my knees almost gave out. I yanked the door open, threw my bag inside, and started the engine with shaking hands. The sound of it filled the clearing, too loud, echoing between the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the forest. A shadow pulling back, a shape too tall to be animal. I didn't wait to know for sure. I pressed the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching. The road was rough, but I didn't care. I drove fast, too fast for the sharp. I had been looking forward to that cabin trip for weeks. The plan was simple: drive up into the woods, stay in the cabin for 4 nights, get away from my phone, the internet, and the constant noise of work. I had saved enough money and rented the place online through a listing that looked trustworthy. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin tucked into the side of a hill, a fire pit outside, a stream not too far away, and enough trees around it to make it feel private. Privacy was what I wanted most. When I finally pulled my car up the narrow gravel road that led to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was slipping lower, the trees casting long shadows over the road. My tires crunched against loose rocks, and I had to slow down more than once just to avoid potholes deep enough to scrape the bottom of the car. By the time the cabin came into view, I felt a wave of relief. It stood exactly like the pictures. Small, 1-story, with a porch that had 2 wooden chairs and a table. There was a stack of firewood on one side, neatly piled and covered with a tarp. I parked close to the porch and got out. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. It was cooler than back in the city, even though it was only about 2 hours away. I unlocked the front door with the code the owner had given me. Inside, the cabin was even simpler than it looked online. One main room with a couch, a small table, and a kitchenette with the basics. A 2-burner stove, a sink, a fridge that hummed louder than I liked. There was a short hallway leading to a bedroom with a single bed and a bathroom at the end. That was it. No television, no internet router blinking in the corner, no signs of modern life besides the fridge and a few outlets. Exactly what I wanted. I spent the first hour unloading my things. I had brought more than I probably needed. Canned food, bottled water, a cooler with ice packs, extra clothes, a lantern, a flashlight, and even a small hatchet I'd bought at a hardware store a week earlier. The cabin already had some supplies. Extra blankets in the closet, matches in a drawer, pots and pans, but I didn't want to rely on them. I liked the idea of being self-sufficient for a few days. By the time I had everything unpacked and in place, the sun was almost gone. The woods outside were darker than I had expected. The trees stood so close together that very little light came through once the sun slipped below the hill. I made myself a quick dinner from a can, washed the dishes, and sat on the porch for a while. The silence was heavy. Back home, I was always aware of cars in the distance, neighbors talking, sirens now and then. Out here, it was nothing but the faint rustle of leaves and the sound of insects. At first it felt peaceful, but the longer I sat, the more it felt like the silence was pressing in on me. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the cabin made me tense up. The refrigerator clicking on, the wood popping as it settled, the wind brushing against the window. All of it sounded louder than it should. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling until I finally drifted off sometime after midnight. The next day was better. With the sunlight pouring in through the trees, the place felt safer. I took a short hike along the stream, cooked lunch outside over the fire pit, and even dozed in one of the chairs on the porch. I started to think maybe I had overreacted the first night. It was just a matter of adjusting. But that second night, something happened that made me feel different. I had gone to bed around 10, tired from walking most of the day. I woke up again at maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. It was pitch dark inside the cabin. My first thought was that I needed to use the bathroom, but then I froze. I could hear something outside. It wasn't the wind, not the sound of branches swaying or leaves brushing against each other. This was slower, heavier, a crunch of gravel, then silence, then another crunch, like footsteps. I held my breath and listened. They stopped, then started again, closer this time. My car was parked only a few feet from the porch. The sound seemed to be right near it. Then another sound, metal tapping. My stomach sank. It was the sound of someone's hand brushing against the car door handle. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, staring at the black ceiling. The crunching sound circled the cabin. Slow steps, deliberate, one after another. They reached the porch. The wooden boards creaked faintly just once, then stopped. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 30. At some point, the sound went away. I didn't hear the crunch of gravel leaving, though. Just silence again. When morning came, I checked outside. The ground around the cabin was hard-packed dirt and gravel, so there weren't really footprints. My car looked the same. Nothing was moved. Nothing was missing. I tried to tell myself maybe it had been an animal. Maybe a deer had wandered too close, or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew what footsteps sounded like. I had grown up in a neighborhood where I could tell the difference between my dad's heavy boots and my mom's lighter steps on the porch. The sound last night wasn't an animal. It was a person. I considered leaving then, but I had already paid for 4 nights, and part of me hated the thought of running home after only one real scare. I decided to stay, but I kept the hatchet close from then on. I even set it on the table beside the bed at night. The third day passed quietly. I didn't hear anything unusual during daylight. I tried to distract myself by chopping some of the firewood and walking further along the stream. I cooked a decent meal, read a book I had brought, and tried to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. But the third night was worse, much worse. I was lying in bed again, half asleep, when I heard it, a faint scrape, like something brushing against the wall outside the cabin. Then another scrape. I sat up, listening hard. The scrape moved, traveling along the side wall toward the bedroom. Then it stopped. I gripped the hatchet handle with my sweaty hand. My mouth was dry. The scrape started again, this time lower, like something dragging along the wooden siding. Then came the sound of gravel crunching again, footsteps circling to the back of the cabin. There was a small window in the bedroom, and I forced myself to get out of bed and peek through it, careful not to touch the glass. My heart hammered in my chest so hard I thought it would give me away. In the faint moonlight, I saw movement near the tree line. A figure, human. They were standing still, just at the edge where the light didn't reach fully. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of someone tall. Their shoulders hunched, heads slightly tilted. They weren't moving, just standing there, looking at the cabin. I ducked down, pressing my back against the wall. My hands shook so much I could barely keep hold of the hatchet. I waited. My mind kept racing through choices. Should I run for the car, call for help, or stay quiet? The cell service here was unreliable, and I hadn't checked it since arriving. The figure didn't approach again that night, or if they did, I was too scared to check. I sat there until the sky started to lighten. When I finally went outside in the morning, there was nothing, just the woods, the stream, the silence. But I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I didn't care about the money anymore. Something was wrong. Someone had been out there watching me, testing how close they could get. I started packing quickly. I threw clothes into my bag, grabbed the food I hadn't opened, stuffed everything into the car. But when I went to start it, my stomach dropped again. The driver's side door was smeared with dirt, for streaks, like someone's fingers had dragged across it. They hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine started, thank God. I pulled onto the gravel road, not even bothering to check if I'd left anything inside. The drive back down that narrow road felt longer than before. Every turn, every shadow, I kept checking the mirrors, convinced I'd see a figure stepping out of the trees. But the road stayed empty. When I finally hit pavement again, I didn't stop. I drove all the way home, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. That night, back in my apartment, I finally let myself breathe. I locked every door, checked every window. I sat on the couch and tried to tell myself I was safe now. But even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about it. Whoever was out there never tried to break in, never showed their face, never said a word. They just stood in the dark, watching, testing, waiting. The scariest part isn't what happened, it's what didn't happen. Because I don't know if they would have come closer the next night or the one after that. I don't know if they were waiting for me to let my guard down. And I'll never know how long they had been out there before I even heard them for the first time. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The idea of getting away from everything, leaving behind the noise, the constant movement, and the people was what kept me pushing through the long workdays leading up to it. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far enough that cell service would be spotty, and the only way to reach it was through a single dirt road that twisted for miles through thick trees. It was the kind of place where once you arrived, you were cut off, and that was exactly what I thought I wanted. When I pulled up, the cabin looked even smaller than the pictures. It had one floor made of rough wood, with a simple porch and 2 windows in the front. The roof sagged a little, and the steps creaked under my weight when I carried my bags inside. Inside it smelled of dust and wood, mixed with that faint damp scent that comes from being closed up for too long. There was no real furniture, just a small table, 2 chairs, an old couch with a blanket thrown over it, and a narrow bed in the single bedroom. The kitchen was little more than a counter, a sink with a pump faucet, and a wood stove. I felt both uneasy and excited. I spent the first hour opening windows to let air in, wiping dust off the table, and stacking my supplies where they would be easy to reach. I had brought a cooler with enough food for several days, bottles of water, and some cans in case the pump water wasn't good. There was a lantern and 2 flashlights, since I knew the cabin had no electricity. I kept my phone with me, but as expected, there was no signal. At first, the silence felt comforting. I could hear only the faint rustle of wind moving through the trees and the occasional sound of birds calling from deep in the woods. No cars, no voices, no hum of appliances, just empty space. I sat on the porch as the light faded, drinking a bottle of water and watching the sun sink down behind the line of trees. When night came, the darkness was heavy. Without power, the inside of the cabin was swallowed by it, and even with my lantern lit, the shadows pressed in against the walls. I sat for a while, listening to the night sounds, the chirping of insects, the croak of frogs, the shifting of branches. But after a while, I started to notice something else. Every so often, there was a crack from the woods, louder than just a branch moving in the breeze. It was sharp like a step on something dry. First, I brushed it off. Animals were everywhere here, and the woods were full of deer, raccoons, or maybe even a bear. But once you notice a sound like that, you can't stop listening for it. I told myself to ignore it. I locked the door, checked the windows, and forced myself to lie down on the bed. The mattress sagged, the springs squeaked, and the blanket smelled faintly of mildew, but eventually I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up at some point in the night. It was still dark, the kind of black where you can't see the outline of anything, and I couldn't remember why I opened my eyes. Then I heard it, a noise from outside, slow, dragging, like something moving just beyond the porch. I held still, straining my ears. For a long time, nothing. Then a single sharp sound like a shoe scraping wood. I sat up, my heart pounding. The lantern was next to me, but I didn't light it. I just sat in the dark, listening. I thought about calling out, but the idea of hearing no answer, or worse, hearing one, froze me. I stayed like that until my chest ached from holding my breath. After a long time, the noises stopped. Eventually, I lay back down and forced myself to close my eyes. When I woke in the morning, sunlight came through the cracks in the shutters, and everything felt different. The air seemed lighter, the woods harmless again. I tried to laugh at myself for being so tense. Probably just an animal. I made coffee on the stove, ate a granola bar, and decided to take a walk down the dirt road to stretch my legs. The trees on either side pressed close, tall and old, with thick undergrowth that made it hard to see far into the woods. The dirt road was uneven and scattered with stones. As I walked, I tried not to think about the night before, but it stayed with me. Every time I heard a branch snap or leaves rustle, I felt the same uneasy tightness in my stomach. I didn't see anyone else, though, and after about a mile, I turned back. When I got to the cabin again, I stopped on the porch. The steps were covered in dirt marks that hadn't been there before. At first, I thought maybe I had tracked them up myself, but the pattern wasn't right. They weren't boot prints like mine. They were smaller, almost like bare feet, pressed faintly into the wood. My throat went dry as I stared at them. They weren't clear enough to be certain, but they didn't look like any animal I could think of. I went inside quickly and shut the door. I tried to distract myself by cleaning, reading, and even napping, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The woods didn't feel quiet anymore. They felt watchful. Every creak of the cabin, every tap of a branch against the window made me jolt. That night, I stayed awake longer, lantern lit, sitting on the couch with my flashlight in my hand. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to wonder if maybe I was just scaring myself for no reason. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard the steps again. Slow, careful, moving along the side of the cabin. I froze, holding the flashlight tightly, afraid to even breathe. The sound came closer, and I could swear I felt the floorboards of the cabin faintly vibrate under my feet, as if something was brushing against the walls. I pointed the flashlight toward the window, but the shutter was closed, and all I saw was wood. Then came the creak of the porch step. I didn't move. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my head. Then another creak, and another. The steps were moving toward the door. I wanted to run, to shout, to do anything, but I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the handle to turn. But it never did. After what felt like forever, the steps retreated. The porch went silent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When daylight finally came, I went outside and checked again. More marks on the porch, clearer this time. Bare feet. The sight made my stomach turn. I spent the day on edge, every sound sending me to the window. I thought about leaving, but the dirt road was long, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I couldn't be sure if I would even find help before nightfall. The third night was worse. The noises started earlier, before midnight. More steps, this time circling the cabin, slow and steady, pausing now and then like whoever or whatever it was listening. My mouth was dry, and I sat with my flashlight pointed at the door, my muscles aching from how stiff I was. The creaks came closer again. Then, for the first time, I heard the faint sound of breathing outside the window. It was slow, deep, and steady, the kind of sound a person makes when standing close. I could picture someone standing just inches away, separated from me by thin wooden planks. The rest of the night passed like that. Sounds of steps, breathing, movement, circling me in the dark. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag without caring how it fit. I didn't even eat. I just locked the door behind me and hurried down the dirt road. The trees closed in on both sides, and every snap of a branch made me jump, but I didn't stop. It took hours before I reached the main road. My legs ached, sweat soaked my shirt, and my throat was raw from thirst. But when I finally saw a car passing, I waved until it stopped. I climbed in without explaining much, just saying my car was still back near the cabin and I needed a ride to town. I never went back for the car. I called the rental company later, told them something was wrong, and asked them to handle it. I didn't care if I lost money. I didn't care about leaving things behind. All I cared about was not setting foot in that place again. Even now, weeks later, I can't get the sound out of my head. That slow creak of footsteps circling the cabin, and that breathing just beyond the window. Whoever it was never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves. And that's what makes it worse. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. It was someone out there waiting, watching, and for 3 nights straight, they knew exactly where I was. That trip was supposed to be an escape. Instead, it left me with the kind of fear that doesn't go away when the sun comes up. I had been planning to spend a week alone in the mountains for some time, just to clear my head and get away from everything. The small wooden cabin I had rented was in a remote valley about 2 hours from the nearest town. The drive out there was slow because the road turned from pavement to gravel and then to a narrow dirt path that twisted between tall pine trees. The cabin sat in a clearing at the base of a slope, with forest surrounding it on all sides. It was old but sturdy, with a porch that faced a small creek that cut through the grass not too far away. There were no neighbors, no power lines, and no cell service. The owner had told me it had a working wood stove for heat, propane for cooking, and a well for water. That was all I needed. When I arrived the first afternoon, the air smelled of pine and damp earth. The trees rose high and crowded the edges of the clearing. The cabin looked small compared to the forest around it. It had one front door, 2 windows on the main wall, and another window on the side. The wood was dark and weathered from years of storms. The porch creaked under my boots when I stepped onto it. The first thing I noticed inside was how dim it was, even in daylight, because of the trees blocking most of the sun. The cabin was only one room with a small bathroom attached. A bed sat in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in another, and the stove stood near the wall opposite the windows. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in. My bag held clothes, some food, a few tools, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I stacked firewood inside, filled a pot with water from the well, and started a small fire in the stove to take the chill out of the air. The sound of the fire crackling was the only thing I could hear besides the faint rush of the creek outside. At first it felt peaceful, exactly what I had been hoping for. But that night, lying in bed, I realized how loud the silence really was. Without traffic or voices, every small noise stood out. The wind moving through the trees sounded like someone shifting their weight in the dark. When the cabin creaked, it felt like footsteps. I tried to ignore it and finally drifted to sleep. The second day I spent hiking around the area, learning the lay of the land. The forest was thick, with fallen logs and boulders scattered between the trees. The slope behind the cabin climbed steeply, and if I pushed up far enough, I could see over the valley to another ridge in the distance. There was no sign of other people, no houses, no camps, no trails. It struck me how isolated I really was. That thought carried both comfort and unease. By the third night, I had settled into a rhythm. But while I sat by the stove reading, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind or the creek. It was a short, heavy crack, like a branch breaking under weight. My head went still. I waited, but nothing followed. After a while, I tried to convince myself it was a deer moving through the trees. Still, when I stepped out onto the porch with my flashlight, the beam lit only the first line of trees. Beyond that was complete blackness. I didn't see anything, but the hairs on my arms stood up. The next morning, I looked around the clearing. In the soft dirt near the creek, I noticed impressions that looked like footprints. They were faint but larger than mine and spaced farther apart. They led from the trees toward the water and then back into the forest. I crouched down and touched the ground. The soil was still slightly soft from recent rain, and the prints couldn't have been more than a day old. I tried to tell myself it was just a hunter passing through, but the idea of someone walking so close to the cabin without me noticing left me unsettled. That day I couldn't relax. Every sound outside seemed sharper. I walked the perimeter of the clearing more than once, looking for signs of people. There were no tire marks, no campfires, nothing else. Only those prints. That night, the noises came back. I heard movement in the woods, faint but steady. It was like someone circling the clearing, staying just beyond sight. The sound would fade and then return on the other side. My chest tightened as I sat in the dark, the fire burning low. I held the flashlight but didn't go outside this time. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for it to stop. When it finally did, the silence was worse. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. By the fifth day, I was questioning whether staying alone had been a good idea. I kept replaying the sound in my head, wondering if I had imagined it. But when I went to the creek that afternoon, I found fresh signs. The same kind of prints were there again, pressed into the mud. They were closer to the cabin this time. I followed them to the edge of the trees but stopped when I realized how deep the forest was. Whoever it was could have been watching me from the cover of the trees while I stood exposed in the clearing. That evening, I decided to make the cabin as secure as I could. I checked the windows, locked the door, and placed a heavy chair against it. I stacked more wood inside so I wouldn't need to go out during the night. When it grew dark, I let the fire burn high for comfort, though the light probably made the cabin more visible from outside. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that froze me. It wasn't in the woods this time. It was on the porch, a slow creak of wood under weight. My chest locked up as I sat in bed, holding my breath. The sound came again, closer to the door. The chair I had placed against it rattled slightly, like something brushed it from the other side. I stayed still, gripping the flashlight, barely able to breathe. After what felt like forever, the sound moved away. Another creak, then silence. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I opened the door and checked the porch. On the dusty boards were faint smudges where someone's shoes had pressed down. They were not boots for hiking but regular shoes, the kind someone would wear in town. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was had come right up to the cabin in the middle of the night. The sixth day dragged on. Every time I heard a bird move in the brush, I flinched. I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept checking the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there. By evening, my nerves were raw. When darkness fell, I sat with the flashlight in my lap, waiting. Hours passed with only the sound of the stove. Then it started again. Slow steps in the woods, circling. My throat felt dry, and I realized I couldn't stay another night like this. I needed to leave. To first light, I packed quickly. My hands shook as I shoved clothes into my bag. I loaded the car and started it up, the sound of the engine breaking the silence of the valley. As I pulled away down the dirt path, I looked once at the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shape stepping back into the shadows. I drove until the dirt turned to gravel and then to pavement, not stopping until I reached town. Only then did I feel the tightness in my chest begin to ease. When I returned the keys to the cabin's owner, I didn't mention what had happened. I only said I had cut the trip short. But the image of those footprints, the sound of steps on the porch, and the sense of being watched stayed with me. I knew it hadn't been my imagination. The week I had wanted for peace had turned into the longest days I could remember, each one thick with dread. I had gone looking for quiet but found only silence that hid someone else moving just beyond sight. Someone who had walked right up to where I slept. And I knew, even as I drove home, that I would never return to a cabin alone again. I had been looking forward to spending some time alone in the cabin for weeks. The stress of work, the constant noise of the city, and the routine of daily life had been pulling me down for months. When a coworker mentioned they had a relative who owned an old cabin deep in the woods, far away from towns and traffic, I jumped at the chance to borrow it. They told me it was simple, nothing fancy, but quiet and isolated, and that was exactly what I wanted. I was not looking for comfort or luxury. I just wanted silence, trees, the smell of pine, and nights without car horns or loud neighbors. The drive out there was long, nearly 4 hours from the last proper highway. The last stretch was on a dirt road that was barely maintained. My car shook and bounced over rocks, dust coated the windshield, and branches scratched against the sides as I drove deeper into the woods. I had downloaded an offline map since there was no service in the area, and even with that, I checked my compass twice to make sure I wasn't lost. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was already low, throwing long shadows between the trees. The cabin itself was exactly what I expected. Small, single floor, wooden walls that looked gray from years of weather, a roof that sagged a little in the middle. There was a porch in the front with 2 broken chairs, and the windows were streaked with dirt. A rusted metal chimney poked from the roof. Behind the cabin was a shed, leaning to one side like it had been hit by years of storms. The place looked tired but sturdy, the kind of building that had been standing for decades and would probably stand for decades more, whether anyone lived in it or not. I parked near the porch, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. It was so still. No traffic, no voices, not even the faint background hum I was used to from the city. Just trees, thick all around me, and the occasional creak of branches. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a small wood stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed against the wall with an old mattress, and a counter with a few shelves. No running water, no electricity except for a small generator out back. A lantern hung from a hook in the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. I unpacked slowly, stacking food I had brought in boxes along one wall, filling a jug of water from containers I had hauled in the car, setting out blankets on the bed. I felt good, tired, but calm. This was what I needed, a place away from everything. I told myself I would spend 3 nights here. That was the plan. The first night was uneventful. I lit the stove, cooked some canned soup, and sat at the table listening to the crackle of firewood. I wrote a little in a notebook, something I hadn't done in months, just random thoughts. When it got dark, I blew out the lantern and lay down. The woods outside were alive with faint noises, crickets, the distant call of something that might have been an owl, the occasional crack of branches. It made me nervous at first, but then I realized that was just nature doing its normal thing. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up stiff but rested. The sun came through the cracks in the shutters, lighting the dusty floor. I ate a simple breakfast, bread and peanut butter, and stepped outside to walk around. The air was cool, damp with morning dew. The trees were thick and tall, the ground covered in pine needles and patches of moss. There was a narrow trail leading away from the cabin that seemed to disappear deeper into the forest. I decided I'd follow it later, maybe after lunch. For most of the day, I tried to relax. I read a book I had brought, chopped some wood I found stacked behind the shed, and sat on the porch watching the forest. But sometime in the afternoon, I had this strange sense that I wasn't completely alone. I didn't see or hear anything unusual at first, but I felt it. That prickly feeling on the back of the neck. like when you're sure someone is watching you. I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to being in such isolation. I was used to seeing people all the time. Out here, there was nobody, so my brain was probably tricking me into thinking something was off. But then I noticed something. The trail I had been planning to explore, it looked like it had been used recently. The dirt had footprints. Not fresh, but not old either. At least one set, maybe two. The prints were larger than mine, boot-shaped. I crouched and touched one. It was firm, not washed away by rain. Someone had walked this trail within the last week or so. Maybe hunters, maybe loggers, maybe someone else who used the cabin sometimes. Still, it made me uneasy. I wasn't expecting to find signs of anyone out here. That night, I slept lighter. I kept waking to small noises, twigs snapping, something brushing against the cabin wall. I told myself it was animals, deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. But each time I woke up, my heart was pounding harder than it should have been. On the third day, things became worse. It started when I went out behind the cabin to chop more firewood. The shed door, which I was sure I had left closed, was open. Just a crack, but open. I stood staring at it for a while. I hadn't been inside the shed yet. I walked closer and pushed it open. The smell hit me first. Old damp wood, mildew, and something faintly sour. Inside, the shed was filled with broken tools, rusty nails, coils of rope, and piles of rotting boards. At the back was an old axe leaning against the wall. I picked it up and set it by the cabin door, figuring it might be useful. But the whole time I had this feeling that someone had been in there recently. Later, I decided to walk the trail. I followed it slowly, careful to notice the ground. The prints were clearer further in, boot marks pressed deep into the dirt. Some turned off into the trees, but I didn't follow those. After about half a mile, I came to a small clearing. There, in the middle of it, was a fire pit. Charred logs, blackened stones, ashes that looked fairly recent. Someone had camped here, not weeks ago, days ago, maybe even last night. I felt a cold weight in my stomach. Whoever it was, they were nearby. Maybe they still were. I turned back quickly, moving faster than before, listening hard to every sound. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence, broken only by my footsteps. When I reached the cabin, I closed the shutters, bolted the door, and sat by the stove for hours, listening. That night was the worst. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt like footsteps. Around midnight, I heard something for real soft, slow crunching outside the wall, moving from the side of the cabin toward the porch. My chest went tight. I held my breath and stayed completely still. The sound stopped for a long moment. Then, faintly, I heard the porch boards creak. Someone was standing out there. I sat frozen, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. After what felt like forever, the sound moved again, slow steps circling the cabin. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. Whatever peace I had hoped to find here was gone. The sense of being watched was too strong, and now I knew for sure someone was nearby. Maybe they were harmless. Maybe just another person living rough in the woods. But I couldn't take the risk. When I stepped outside, I saw it. On the porch, right by the door, was a boot print in the dirt. Fresh, from last night. I packed fast. Food, clothes, everything thrown into bags. I went to start my car, but my heart nearly stopped when I saw the tires. Both front tires were slashed, the rubber torn open in long, deep cuts. Someone had done it during the night. Panic surged through me. I was miles from the nearest road, no cell service, and now no way to drive out. My mind raced, trying to figure what to do. I thought about walking, but the dirt road was long, and I didn't even know if it led anywhere safe. If someone had slashed my tires, they didn't want me leaving. I went back inside, locked the door, and grabbed the axe. My only real weapon. I sat by the window, peeking through a crack in the shutter, watching the trees. Hours passed like that, the sun moving across the sky, shadows stretching. And then I saw movement. Far between the trees, maybe 50 yards away, a figure, standing still, watching the cabin. Too far to see clearly, but definitely a person. Tall, broad shoulders, dark clothes. They didn't move for a long time, just stood there. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the woods and vanished. That was when I truly understood how much danger I was in. The rest of the day I stayed inside, listening, waiting. As night fell, the fear grew heavier. I knew they would come back. Whoever it was, they had cut my tires, circled the cabin, stood outside watching me. They weren't just passing through. They were targeting me. That night, I heard the sounds again. Steps closer this time. The porch creaked once more. The doorknob rattled gently, as if tested. Then scratching, faint but deliberate, along the wall. I gripped the axe so hard my hands ached, staring at the door. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, tired from the drive and wanting nothing more than to unpack and settle in for a quiet evening. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees that stretched up like walls on all sides. The place looked worn but sturdy, with dark wood siding and a steep roof that had patches of moss clinging to the shingles. A single gravel road led in from the highway, twisting and narrow, almost hidden among the trees, and when I pulled up in front of the cabin, I could already feel the quiet pressing in around me. I had rented the cabin for a week. I wanted time away from everything. No phones ringing, no neighbors nearby, no city noise. I thought it would be good for me, just me and the woods, some time to read and write, to breathe air that wasn't heavy with exhaust. When I stepped out of the car, the first thing I noticed was how still it was. No voices, no passing cars, not even the sound of a plane overhead. Just the whisper of wind moving through the trees and the faint creaking of branches swaying. The cabin had a small porch, and when I walked up the wooden steps, they groaned under my weight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. There was a main room with a couch, a coffee table, and a small fireplace with blackened stone around it. To one side was a kitchen with a counter, a sink, and some cabinets, and beyond that a short hallway that led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. It was simple but had everything I needed. I spent the first hour carrying my bags inside, unpacking some food I had brought, and putting clothes into the small dresser in the bedroom. The sun was lowering, and through the windows the clearing outside was turning orange with the fading light. I noticed how quickly the shadows grew in the trees once the sun dipped lower, as if the woods were swallowing up the daylight. By the time I finished unpacking, it was nearly dark. I heated a can of soup on the stove, ate it at the little table by the window, and listened to the quiet outside. At first it felt peaceful, but after a while the silence became heavy, almost unnatural. I thought about how far I was from anyone else. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and I hadn't seen another house on the gravel road leading in. The cabin was alone, tucked into the woods where no one could see it. When I finished eating, I washed the bowl, set it to dry, and decided to sit outside on the porch for a while. I carried a chair out and placed it by the railing. The night was already deep and the trees were black shapes against a darker sky. Crickets chirped faintly, but beyond that the woods seemed empty. I leaned back in the chair and looked up at the stars. It was while I sat there that I first heard something move in the trees. It was faint, just the sound of something shifting in the underbrush, but it stood out in the silence. At first I told myself it was an animal. Out here there were deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. But the sound wasn't just a rustle and gone. It was a steady movement, like something was walking slowly through the trees. I leaned forward and tried to see, but the darkness was too heavy. The trees formed a wall just beyond the edge of the clearing, and past that everything was shadows. The sound stopped after a while, and I told myself again it was an animal, nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, close enough to hear, maybe even close enough to watch me. I went back inside and locked the door. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The bed was fine, but the silence was not. Every small noise stood out. The creak of the wood as the cabin settled, the whisper of wind against the roof, the occasional pop from the cooling stove in the kitchen. I drifted in and out of sleep, always half awake, listening without meaning to. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, faint and dragging across the porch, but when I sat up and held my breath, the sound was gone. I told myself I was dreaming, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning I woke early, the room bright with sunlight. The world looked harmless in the day. I made coffee, ate a simple breakfast, and decided to take a walk down the gravel road. I wanted to see more of the woods around me and stretch my legs after the long drive yesterday. The road curved and sloped through the trees, sometimes narrow, sometimes widening where patches of grass had grown along the edges. Birds darted from branch to branch overhead, and I saw tracks in the dirt where deer had crossed. I walked for about an hour before turning back. The whole time I didn't see another person, not even a car. It was as if I had the entire forest to myself. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, close to where the trees began, there were marks in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks, not deer or raccoon. They looked like shoe prints, faint but clear enough to see the shape of a heel and sole. I crouched down and looked closer. The prints led from the trees into the clearing but stopped before reaching the cabin. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ground. Someone had been here. The thought made my stomach tighten. I tried to think of reasons. Maybe a hiker had passed through, maybe a hunter. But the cabin was not on a trail, and the road was the only way in. Whoever it was had walked out of the woods into the clearing and then turned back. I spent the rest of the day uneasy. I tried to read, tried to write, but I kept glancing at the windows. I told myself again and again it was nothing. Still, I made sure the door was locked whenever I was inside. That night was worse. I had built a fire in the fireplace, more for comfort than warmth. I sat on the couch, watching the flames and listening to the crackle of wood. Outside, the woods were silent again. Too silent. It was late when I heard it. A sound from outside, faint at first but growing clearer. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving across the clearing. My heart pounded as I sat frozen on the couch, listening. The steps crunched on gravel, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I got up slowly and turned off the lamp, leaving only the firelight. I stood near the window, not daring to move the curtain too much, and peered outside. The clearing was empty. The trees stood black and still, but the sound had been real. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up in the bedroom with the door locked, every muscle tight, listening for any sound. Sometimes I thought I heard movement, a faint scraping against the wood outside, a shift on the porch. But nothing ever came through the door, and when morning arrived, the world looked normal again. When I went outside, I found more prints, fresh ones in the dirt near the porch, shoes larger than mine. They circled the cabin and then vanished back into the trees. I had been looking forward to some time alone for a while. Life in the city had been wearing me down, with noise that never stopped, streets that never slept, and neighbors who were always too close. When I found a small rental cabin deep in the woods, I thought it was exactly what I needed. The photos made it look simple, but it had everything I cared about. A roof, for walls, a wood stove, and no one else around for miles. The man who listed it said it was isolated, about 40 minutes from the nearest town, with a rough dirt road leading up to it. That was the appeal for me. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel cut off from everything. I packed heavy. Food that would last a week, bottled water, warm clothes, extra blankets, a small hatchet, a good flashlight, spare batteries, a first aid kit, and some tools. I also had my phone and a power bank, though I wasn't counting on cell service that deep in the woods. I drove out one morning, following the GPS until it lost signal, then relying on the instructions written down. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rougher than I expected, with potholes deep enough to make me slow to a crawl. Branches scratched against the sides of my car as the trees closed in tighter, and it felt like I was driving into a place forgotten by everyone. When I finally reached the cabin, it was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but it was standing solid. The roof had some moss, the porch was a little tilted, and the wooden steps creaked under my boots, but the door opened easily, and the inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. There was one main room with a small stove, a table, and a cot against the wall. A separate smaller space served as a kind of storage area where extra firewood was stacked. No electricity, no plumbing, just four log walls holding back the wilderness. I unloaded my supplies, stacked the food on the table, and set up my bedding on the cot. It felt quiet in a way that made the city seem like a different world. The air outside was damp and cool, filled with the smell of pine and earth. When the sun dropped lower, the woods grew darker faster than I expected. By the time I lit the lantern inside, it already felt like midnight, though it was barely past 6. That first night was peaceful. I built a small fire in the stove, listened to it crackle, and let the silence surround me. It was the kind of silence that wasn't really silent at all. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves outside, the occasional distant sound of a branch cracking, and sometimes the call of an owl. It was all natural, all expected. When I lay down on the cot, I thought it might take me a while to fall asleep in such a different place, but my body relaxed quicker than I expected. The next morning, I woke with light spilling through the small window. My breath came out in small clouds. It had gotten colder overnight. I added more wood to the stove and made a simple breakfast. Then I decided to explore a little. I didn't wander too far, just circled around the cabin and followed a narrow deer trail into the trees. The ground was damp, soft with layers of fallen needles and leaves. The forest was thick, and even a short walk in made me lose sight of the cabin. I marked a few trees with small cuts from my hatchet so I wouldn't lose my way back. About 15 minutes in, I stopped. I didn't hear anything unusual at first, but I got the strange feeling that the woods around me had gone too still. No bird calls, no rustling, just stillness. It only lasted maybe half a minute. Then a gust of wind pushed through the trees, and the sounds came back. I shook it off, telling myself I was just not used to the silence out there. Back at the cabin, I spent the day chopping some firewood, reading from the one book I had brought, and taking short naps. The second night was colder, and I wrapped myself in both blankets. Sometime in the night, I woke up. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the cabin was almost dark except for faint orange embers. I thought I had heard something outside. It was sharp, like a quick snapping sound, not far from the porch. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer stepping on a branch. I held still on the cot, listening. The sound didn't repeat, but after a while, I heard what could have been the faintest crunch of footsteps on the dirt outside. Slow, deliberate, but then stopping. I didn't move. My heartbeat felt loud in my chest. I strained my ears, waiting. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably just another animal, raccoons, maybe. They could wander close looking for food. I stayed awake a long time, staring at the ceiling, until sleep finally took me again. The next morning, when I stepped out onto the porch, I noticed something in the dirt just beyond the steps. Footprints, not animal prints. Human. They weren't mine. The size looked close to mine, maybe a little smaller, and they led out from the edge of the trees toward the cabin, stopping near the porch, then turning back. I felt a tightness in my chest when I saw them. I walked around slowly, looking for more. There were faint tracks circling the cabin, spaced apart like someone had been pacing around during the night. I spent the whole day unsettled. My mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone lost. Maybe the owner of the cabin came to check on it. But the idea that someone had walked around the cabin in the middle of the night without making themselves known stuck in my head. If it had been the owner, why wouldn't they knock? Why circle the place quietly? I locked the door that night. The latch wasn't much, just a simple bolt, but it was something. I kept the hatchet close to the cot. Sleep was harder to find. I lay there listening for hours, every small sound amplified in my mind. At some point after midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of steps. This time, more than once. Someone was out there, moving slowly, circling. I held my breath, gripping the handle of the hatchet in the dark. The steps would stop, then start again. At one point, I was sure they were right outside the window. I didn't move until the first pale light of morning came through the trees. When I finally stepped outside, I saw more footprints in the dirt, fresher, clearer. They circled again. Someone had been there for hours, moving around in the dark. I felt a deep pit in my stomach. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They knew exactly where the cabin was, and they weren't trying to be found. That day, I thought about leaving. The problem was the road. It was rough, long, and if I left late, I could end up stuck driving through the woods at night. Part of me thought maybe it was just a passing stranger and they wouldn't come back. But another part of me felt watched every time I stepped outside. I noticed small things, too. A tree branch broken near the trail, the faint sound of movement in the distance when I tried to fetch more wood. That night was the worst. I bolted the door, stacked a chair under the handle, and kept the lantern burning low. The noises started earlier this time. Twigs snapping, dirt crunching, slow, patient movement all around. Whoever it was didn't try to hide it anymore. It was like they wanted me to know they were there. At one point, I heard the porch steps creak under weight. I stared at the door, every muscle tense, gripping the hatchet so tight my hand ached. The latch held. The door never opened, but the sound of breathing, slow and steady, came from just beyond it. I don't know how long it lasted. Hours, maybe. I didn't sleep at all. When the morning finally came, I stepped outside and saw the clear shape of a handprint smudged against the window glass. That was when I made my decision. I packed everything as fast as I could, throwing it into bags without order. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just loaded my car and started it. The road back felt longer than before. Every turn of the dirt path, I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone step out from the trees. My hands shook on the steering wheel. When I finally reached the paved road, I didn't stop. I drove all the way back to town, then another hour beyond before I pulled into a crowded parking lot and sat there, just breathing. Only then did it feel like I had left that place behind. I never went back. I never told the owner why I left early, and I never asked who else might have known about that cabin. But I still think about it. How someone had been out there in the dark, circling, watching, waiting, not saying a word, not trying to break in, just being there. And how, if I had stayed one more night, maybe the latch on that door wouldn't have been enough. I had been planning the cabin trip for weeks. The cabin was an old wooden place that I had rented out in the mountains, surrounded by thick forest and sitting far back on a dirt road that most people never drove down. It was one of those cabins that looked simple but had everything I needed. A wood stove, a small bed, a kitchen with a working sink, and a fridge that ran off a generator. There wasn't any cell service out there, which was part of the reason I chose it. I wanted the quiet. I wanted the kind of silence you can't get in the city. When I arrived, the air smelled like pine and damp earth. The dirt road twisted for miles before I even saw the small clearing where the cabin sat. I parked the car close to the porch, carried my things inside, and checked every room just to get a sense of the place. The cabin had 2 small rooms, the main living space with the stove and kitchen, and a small bedroom off to the side with one narrow window that looked out toward the trees. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, stacked some firewood by the stove, and went out to walk the area before dark. The woods were dense, and the trails weren't marked. I didn't want to go too far, so I stayed within sight of the clearing. The quiet was almost heavy. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional creak of branches moving in the wind. By the time the sun started to set, I was already inside with the stove burning. I ate a simple meal, wrote a little in a notebook I brought, and then sat on the porch for a while to listen to the forest at night. The air turned colder than I expected. When the sun dropped behind the trees, the temperature went down fast, and the clearing was drowned in darkness. There were no streetlights, no glow from nearby houses, just the thick dark of the forest pressing in on all sides. The first night, nothing happened. I slept fine, but the second night was different. I had gone to bed around 10. The stove still had some embers glowing, and the bedroom was warm enough with the door cracked. I lay on the bed staring at the wooden ceiling, letting myself drift off. I didn't know how much time had passed when I woke up again. At first, I thought it was the wind outside that stirred me, but then I realized it wasn't that. It was something else. I heard crunching, leaves and sticks breaking under footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. I froze. I lay on my back, breathing quietly, ears straining. The sound wasn't close to the cabin yet, but it wasn't far either. It came from the direction of the trees near the clearing, the same side where the bedroom window faced. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe even a bear, though the steps sounded too measured for that. They weren't shuffling or quick. They were spaced apart, almost careful. I slid slowly out of bed, trying not to make the old mattress creak. I went to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. The glass was fogged from the warmth inside meeting the cold outside, but I could see enough of the clearing. First, nothing. The moon was only a sliver, so most of the clearing was swallowed in shadows. My eyes adjusted after a few seconds, and that's when I saw it. Someone was standing at the tree line. Not an animal. Person. They weren't moving, just standing there, partly hidden between two trees. I couldn't see their face. I could only make out the shape of their shoulders, the pale tone of a shirt catching faint moonlight, and the stillness of their posture. I froze with the curtain just barely open, my heart pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I stood there for what felt like minutes, not sure if I should move away from the window or keep watching. Then I realized something worse. They were facing the cabin. Directly. I let the curtain fall back into place, stepped backward slowly, and tried to stay calm. My hands were shaking. There was no reason for anyone to be out here this late at night. The road to the cabin was long and rough. No one would just wander up here by accident. I thought about going outside, but the idea of opening that door when someone was out there watching was unbearable. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no service here, and the landline the rental company said used to be in the cabin had been disconnected long ago. The only thing I could do was wait. I went back to the bed, sat on the edge, and listened. After a few minutes, the footsteps came again. This time closer, crunching leaves, snapping twigs. They weren't rushing. They weren't trying to hide. They were just moving at a steady pace toward the cabin. I stood and crept into the main room, my eyes on the front door. The lock was simple, just a metal latch. I tried to remember if I had locked it earlier. I rushed over, heart in my throat, and slid the latch into place. The sound of metal scraping made me flinch. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in from outside. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle because you know it's not empty. You know someone is standing just out of sight. I backed away from the door and stood near the stove, trying to keep my breathing even. Minutes passed. Then came the sound I had been dreading. The slow, deliberate creak of the porch steps. They were on the porch. I stared at the door, every muscle in my body locked tight. The wood of the porch groaned again under their weight. Then again. They were right outside the door. I thought they would knock or try the handle, but they didn't. They just stood there. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were only a few feet away, with nothing but a thin wooden door between us. The floorboards of the porch creaked once more, and then silence. I didn't move. I stood there for what felt like an hour, staring at the door, waiting for anything. A knock, a voice, the rattle of the handle. But nothing came. Eventually, I went back to the bedroom, though I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, listening. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me into a shallow sleep. When I woke, it was daylight. I jumped up and ran to the front door. I opened it quickly, half expecting someone to be there. No one. The clearing looked normal, but when I looked down at the porch, I saw them. Footprints, clear as day, muddy impressions on the old wood of the porch. They came up the steps, stopped right at the door, and never turned back. The whole day I couldn't shake the feeling. I checked the tree line again and again, walked the dirt road a little to see if there were tire tracks or signs of someone camping nearby, but I found nothing. Whoever it was, they had come alone on foot and left no trace of where they went after standing at my door. That night I barely ate. I just sat in the main room with the stove burning, trying to convince myself it wouldn't happen again. But it did. It happened again, worse than before. I had gone to the cabin thinking it would be quiet. That was the whole reason I rented it in the first place. It was tucked far back from the main road, down a dirt path that looked more like a trail than a driveway. The listing online had said it was perfect for people who wanted peace, a place to disconnect from everything, and that was what I thought I needed. I packed some food, clothes, a flashlight, and a few other things, and when I first got there it looked just like the pictures. A small wooden cabin with a front porch, 2 rocking chairs, a single room with a kitchen area on one side, a bed on the other, and a tiny bathroom in the back. It wasn't fancy, but I wasn't looking for fancy. I just wanted space, no noise from cars, no people, no screens buzzing all the time. The first day was calm. I walked around the woods a little, not going too far because the sun was dropping, and then I sat on the porch until it got dark. The air was cooler than I thought it would be, and when the wind moved through the trees, it was the only sound for miles. I went to bed early and slept harder than I had in weeks. That first night gave me the kind of rest I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. The second day was quiet too. I hiked a little farther into the woods, came back, made something simple on the little propane stove, and then read for a while. I liked how there was no phone service out there. I didn't even bring my laptop. I thought to myself that maybe I could stay a week or two and not get tired of it. But the third night changed everything. It was late, probably past midnight. I had been asleep for a few hours already when I woke up. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal noise. It was something different. At first, I couldn't figure it out, but then I realized it was the sound of gravel shifting outside. The kind of crunch you hear when someone steps on a driveway that isn't paved. My body tensed up all at once. I told myself it was maybe a deer or some animal moving close, but then I thought about it harder. Animals don't sound like that. A deer might step heavy once, and then you'd hear brush snapping or hoofs tapping against roots. This sounded like slow, careful steps. Someone was walking just outside the cabin. I stayed as still as I could, my ears straining for every sound. The crunch came again, then silence, then another one. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly. It wasn't random. They were trying not to be heard, but in the dead quiet of the woods, it carried clear. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my head. I thought about turning on the light, but then I stopped myself. If someone was out there, letting them know I was awake might be a bad idea. I didn't know what they wanted. I didn't even know if they knew I was inside. Maybe they thought the cabin was empty. Maybe they thought they could just walk up and see if there was anything worth stealing. The steps stopped for a while, and I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But then I heard the sound of wood flexing slightly, like weight shifting on the porch. Whoever it was had stepped onto the porch boards. I barely breathed. The front door didn't have much of a lock on it. It was just one of those old cabin latches, nothing heavy-duty. If they really wanted to force it open, it wouldn't take much. I lay there in the dark, staring toward the door, waiting. I thought about getting up, but my legs felt frozen. I thought about grabbing something to use as a weapon, but the closest thing I had was a kitchen knife in the drawer. I heard the doorknob rattle lightly, just once, then nothing, then a little harder, then stillness. The person didn't come in, but they stayed there. I could hear the boards creaking as they shifted their weight. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever. My body was stiff with fear, every nerve alert, but I forced myself not to move. After a long time, the boards creaked again, lighter this time, like they were stepping back off the porch. Then came the crunch of gravel, slow again, fading away into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until the faintest light of morning came through the thin curtain. My eyes burned, but I didn't dare close them. When it was daylight, I finally got up and looked around outside. Nothing was broken, nothing was missing, but there were footprints in the dirt around the porch. They weren't boot prints from a hiker or something like that. They looked like old sneakers worn down flat. The prints came from the direction of the tree line, circled the porch, and went back the same way. I thought about leaving right then, packing everything and driving out. But part of me tried to push it down, tell myself it could have been someone wandering, maybe a drunk who had gotten lost or a hunter out too late. The cabin wasn't near any other houses, but maybe there were trails I didn't know about. I told myself it was a one-time thing. The day went by like normal, but I couldn't relax. Every time I stepped outside, I kept looking at the trees. They seemed darker than before, less peaceful. I stayed close to the cabin, not wandering off like the first 2 days. I kept checking the door latch even in the middle of the day. That night, I tried to convince myself I was tired enough to sleep. I lay down, but every little noise made me tense up. Hours passed, and then, just like the night before, I heard it again. The crunch of steps. This time, they didn't stop at the driveway. They came faster, more direct, right to the porch. The boards creaked, and then came the sound of something metal. The doorknob jiggled hard this time, rattling against the latch. My throat went dry. I reached for the kitchen knife I had set beside me before I lay down. My hand shook as I held it. The door didn't open, but the knob twisted back and forth, then stopped. Silence followed. I could hear breathing now, faint, right outside. Someone was standing just inches away, separated from me by only a thin wooden door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tight, waiting for the sound of the door giving way. It never came. After a while, the breathing faded, the porch creaked again, and then the steps moved away into the dark. I didn't move until daylight again. When I finally opened the door, I saw the latch had fresh scratches around it. Someone had tried to force it with something metal, maybe a screwdriver. This time, I didn't try to make excuses. Someone had come back 2 nights in a row. They weren't lost. They weren't wandering. They were trying to get inside. I thought about leaving immediately, but a strange thought hit me. What if they were still watching? What if they were sitting out there in the trees, waiting for me to panic and run so they could follow me on the road? The dirt path leading to the cabin was narrow, full of turns, and surrounded by forest on both sides. If a car tried to block me, I would have nowhere to go. The idea of being trapped on that road felt even worse than staying inside the cabin. So I stayed. That day dragged by. I didn't go outside much, only to gather a few heavy branches I could use as makeshift weapons. I put one near the bed and one by the door. I checked the windows and pushed the furniture against the one near the porch. I didn't eat much. My stomach was too tight to care about food. When night came, I sat in the dark with the knife in my lap, waiting. Hours went by. My eyes kept closing and snapping open again. I thought maybe they wouldn't come. But then, just past midnight, I heard it, the crunch of gravel. This time, the steps didn't stop at the door. They moved along the side of the cabin, slow and careful. Then I heard the faint sound of fingers tapping against the glass window. A light testing sound. I gripped the knife tighter. My hands were slick with sweat. I stared at the window, but I didn't move. Then came another tap. Then another. Then silence. I sat frozen until I heard the steps again, moving around to the back of the cabin. The bathroom window rattled slightly. Then the sound of something scraping against it. I realized they were trying to pry it open. I jumped up, adrenaline pushing me past the fear, and shoved the bathroom door closed. I braced a chair under the knob, pressing it tight. The window rattled harder, but it held. For the next hour, whoever it was circled the cabin, testing windows, trying the door again, scratching at the latch. Each time I thought the sound would stop, it would start again on a different side. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't leaving. They were patient. At some point, the noises stopped. I waited, stiff and trembling, listening for anything. Minutes passed, then hours. When morning light finally came, I dared to check. They were gone. But on the windowsills, on the doorframe, even on the wood of the porch, I saw marks. Long, thin scratches where they had tried to work something in. The ground was covered in prints now. Dozens of them circling the cabin again and again. That was when I knew I couldn't stay. It didn't matter if they were out there waiting. If I stayed another night, they would eventually get in. The latch wasn't strong enough, the windows weren't secure, and I couldn't keep watch forever without sleep. I packed fast. My hands shook so much I dropped things, but I didn't care. I shoved clothes and food into my bag, grabbed the knife, and got into my car. The dirt road stretched out in front of me, and I drove faster than I should have. Every curve, I expected to see another vehicle blocking the way. Every shadow between the trees. I had been planning to spend a week alone at the cabin, far from the noise of the city, hoping to use the time to clear my head and finally finish a few things I had been putting off. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about 40 minutes away from the nearest paved road, hidden among tall trees and quiet valleys. I had been there only a few times before, always in summer with friends, but this time I decided to go alone. It was early fall, the air was cool but not freezing, and the forest was thick with the smell of damp leaves and pine. I thought it would be the perfect time to be alone, with no one around to bother me. The drive out felt longer than usual, probably because I was already tired from the week before. By the time I parked my car at the clearing near the trail, the sun was already starting to set. I grabbed my bags and began walking down the narrow path that led to the cabin. The air grew cooler as the trees closed in over me. The dirt beneath my boots was damp from rain earlier in the week, and I could hear water dripping from branches. Every step away from the car made me feel more isolated. By the time the roof of the cabin came into sight through the trees, the light was fading quickly. I unlocked the door, went inside, and dropped my bags with a sense of relief. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms and a porch. There was no electricity, only a propane lamp, a small wood stove, and a hand pump outside for water. Inside, the air was stale from being closed up for months, so I opened the windows for a while to let in the cold evening air. I set my bags down on the cot in the corner, lit the lamp, and began to settle in. That first night felt calm. I heated a can of soup on the stove, listened to the quiet sounds of the forest, and wrote for a while. The woods around the cabin were so silent that I could hear every rustle outside, every creak of the wooden walls, every pop of the cooling stove. I wasn't nervous yet, just aware of how alone I was. When I finally lay down, the cot creaked beneath me, and I stared at the dark ceiling for a long time before I drifted off. The next morning was gray and cool. I went outside to pump water, the handle squeaking as I worked it up and down. The trees around the clearing were still and wet with dew, the ground soft underfoot. I boiled the water for coffee, sat on the porch with my cup, and tried to enjoy the quiet. It felt peaceful, but there was also something heavy about the silence. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of anything. Just me, the trees, and the faint sound of birds somewhere far off. By midday, I decided to take a walk down the old logging trail that ran behind the cabin. I wanted to stretch my legs and maybe find a good spot to gather some firewood. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places and littered with wet leaves. I walked for almost an hour, watching the way the light filtered through the branches, and then turned back. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The front door was open. I was sure I had closed it. I remembered clearly pulling it shut, hearing the latch click before I left. Now it was hanging slightly open, swaying a little in the breeze. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer. Inside, the room looked normal, nothing out of place at first glance. My bags were still on the cot. The lamp was still on the table. Nothing looked stolen. I told myself maybe the latch hadn't caught, maybe the wind had pushed it open, even though the air hadn't been strong. I checked the lock, pulled the door shut firmly, and tried to brush it off. The rest of that day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some wood, carried water, and tried to read, but my mind kept returning to that door. Every time I glanced at it, I wondered if someone had been inside while I was gone. The woods felt thicker around me, the silence heavier. That night, I built a stronger fire in the stove and left the lamp burning longer than usual. I lay in the cot listening to every sound. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Leaves rustled against the porch. My heart raced at every noise, even though I kept telling myself it was just animals moving through the forest. Eventually, I drifted off, but my sleep was broken and shallow. On the third morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Outside near the pump, in the damp soil, were footprints. They were faint, softened by dew, but they were there. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and fresher than the ones I had left. They led toward the trees, away from the clearing. I stood there staring at them for a long time, the pump handle cold in my hand. Someone had been here, maybe while I slept, maybe while I walked the trail. I didn't know. I carried the water back inside quickly and locked the door, even though the lock was little more than a latch that could be forced open. The day dragged on with a heavy weight in my chest. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing. I didn't wander far, just stayed near the porch and the woodpile, pretending to keep busy but never really focusing on anything. My ears strained for footsteps, for voices, for anything unusual. That night, I barely slept. The cabin creaked, the fire popped, and I thought I heard soft movement outside. Not the quick scurry of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. I lay still, barely breathing, afraid to move. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke in the early gray light with my heart still racing. When I stepped outside, I saw more footprints. This time they were clearer, pressed deep into the damp soil near the woodpile. Whoever it was had been closer, circling the cabin while I lay inside. My hands shook as I traced the prints with my eyes. They moved around the side of the cabin, stopped near the porch, then disappeared back into the trees. I felt trapped. The road was far. My car parked at the trailhead nearly an hour's walk away. If someone was watching me, they could wait along the path. My phone had no signal out here. I thought about leaving, but fear of running into whoever it was kept me frozen. The cabin felt like both a shelter and a trap. Its thin walls the only thing between me and whoever was in the woods. I started keeping the axe inside, propped near the cot. Every sound outside sent me to the window. My stomach ached from nerves. My head pounded from lack of sleep. I stopped going far for water, rushing out to the pump and back, locking the door behind me each time. On the fifth night, the fear became real. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it clearly. The creak of a step on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Then another. The boards groaned under the weight. My body froze, my chest tight, breath caught in my throat. I gripped the axe handle with sweaty hands, staring at the door, waiting for it to move. For long minutes, the sound continued. A step, then silence. Another step. Whoever it was stood just outside, close enough to touch the door. Then came the sound of the latch, rattling softly, tested carefully. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the walls. The latch held, but the sound of it being tested sent waves of cold through me. Eventually, the steps moved away, slowly fading into the leaves. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I opened the door cautiously. The porch showed fresh footprints, clear and sharp in the damp wood. They had stopped right at the door. I knew then this wasn't my imagination. Someone was watching me, waiting, testing. I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my bag quickly, stuffed food and water inside, and strapped the axe to my pack. I kept looking at the tree line, expecting to see movement. I locked the cabin out of habit, even though it wouldn't matter. Then I started down the trail, moving fast, heart hammering. Every snap of a branch behind me made me turn. Every rustle of leaves sent me gripping the axe tighter. The trail felt endless, the woods closing in on every side. More than once I thought I heard steps behind me, matching mine, pausing when I paused. I forced myself to keep moving, sweat cold on my back despite the cool air. When I finally saw the clearing where my car sat, relief washed over me so strong I almost stumbled. I rushed the last stretch, unlocked the door with shaking hands, and threw my bag inside. I started the engine and pulled away, gravel crunching under the tires, never looking back until the cabin was far behind the trees. For the rest of the drive, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see another car following. But the road was empty. When I reached town, the normal sights of people and traffic felt unreal after the silence of the forest. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I told the owner about the footprints and the sounds, he only nodded and said it wasn't the first time someone had reported strange things up there. He thought maybe hunters used the woods or drifters passed through, but no one ever found who it was. For me, that was enough. The cabin had gone from a quiet place of retreat to a place where I felt hunted, watched, and unsafe. Even now, years later, when I hear a creak on the porch or a step in the dark, my mind goes back to that night when someone tested the latch while I lay frozen inside. I decided to spend a few days alone in a cabin that belonged to a friend of mine. It was a small wooden cabin sitting deep in the woods, far away from town. The place was old but strong, and it had everything I needed for a quiet stay. I wanted a break from the noise of my daily life, and being in the middle of the forest seemed like the best way to clear my mind. I packed some clothes, food, water, a flashlight, a camping knife, and a few other essentials before heading out there. I also brought a small cooler with perishable food and a sleeping bag, even though the cabin had a bed, because I liked to be prepared. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The road that led to the cabin turned into a rough dirt path for the last few miles, and eventually I had to park my car at a small clearing and carry my bags the rest of the way. The air was damp and cool, and the smell of pine and wet soil surrounded me as soon as I stepped out of the car. The trail was narrow and uneven, covered with roots and fallen branches, and it took me a little while to reach the cabin. The cabin itself stood in a quiet clearing, half hidden by tall trees. It was a one-room structure with a small porch, a slanted roof, and a stone chimney. The wood was dark from age, and the windows had thick frames. Inside, there was a small bed, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with some old canned food, and a wood stove. There was no electricity, no plumbing, and no phone signal. It was exactly what I had expected. I put my things down and opened the small windows to let in some air. The inside smelled a little musty from being closed for weeks, maybe months. After airing it out, I stacked the food I brought on the table and arranged my gear. The silence around the cabin was heavy, broken only by birds and the occasional rustle of branches. That first night was uneventful. I lit a few candles and read a book until it got late. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, cleaned up, and then laid in bed. The forest outside was alive with sounds. Frogs croaking near water, crickets, owls. It was different from the city, but not frightening. I fell asleep easily. The next morning, I woke early and stepped outside. The ground was damp from dew, and a light mist hung between the trees. I decided to walk further into the woods, following no real trail. I carried my knife, a small water bottle, and a snack, and I kept track of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. The woods grew dense quickly, and after about an hour of walking, I found a stream. The water was cold and clear, and I sat for a while, just listening to it move over the rocks. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was high, and I felt calm and relaxed. I cooked lunch, took a short nap, and spent the afternoon chopping some wood from a pile of logs left near the cabin. It felt good to do physical work. That night, however, something felt different. I had gone to bed after putting out the candles, and the forest seemed quieter than before. I lay in the darkness, listening. There were no crickets, no frogs, not even the sound of an owl. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but the silence stretched on. Eventually, I drifted off, but it was a light and restless sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke suddenly. It was pitch dark inside, and for a moment I didn't know what had woken me. I sat still and listened. Then I heard it, the crunch of leaves outside. Slow, heavy steps, not the quick sound of an animal. They moved around the side of the cabin, stopping now and then starting again. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I lay frozen in bed, gripping my knife, waiting for something more. Minutes passed, and finally the silence returned. I stayed awake until dawn, unable to sleep again. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and sure enough, there were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine, and they were fresh. The prints led from the woods, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the trees. My stomach sank as I realized someone had been out there, watching. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through, or maybe a hiker who got curious about the cabin. Still, the unease lingered. I kept my knife close that day, and I avoided going too far from the cabin. I chopped more wood, stayed busy, and tried not to think too much about it. But by evening, as the sky darkened, the nerves came back. I locked the cabin door that night. The lock was small and old, but it was something. I set my knife on the table next to the bed and left a candle burning low so the inside wouldn't be completely dark. Again, the woods outside fell into silence. I barely slept, my ears tuned to every sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. The steps, this time slower, closer. The sound of weight shifting on the wooden porch boards made the hairs on my arms stand up. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside the door. The faint creak of wood under pressure carried into the cabin. I sat up in bed, barely breathing, staring at the door in the dim candlelight. After what felt like forever, the steps moved again, this time toward the window. I saw a shadow shift across the glass, just the faintest outline. I froze completely, then nothing. Minutes dragged. The person must have walked away, but I didn't hear them leave. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife until my hand ached. When the morning light finally filled the cabin, I forced myself to step outside. Again, fresh footprints in the dirt. They were close this time, right up to the porch. My chest tightened as I studied them. Whoever it was had been right at the door, right at the window, in the middle of the night. I thought about leaving, packing my things and walking back to my car. But the idea of carrying everything through the woods with someone possibly watching was even worse. I decided to stay one more night, but I made a plan. I stacked some furniture against the door, and I placed empty cans from my food along the windowsills so that if anyone tried to come in, the noise would wake me. I kept my knife at my side at all times. That night was the longest of my life. I barely blinked, staring at the door and listening. Around midnight, the steps came again. This time, slower, heavier. Whoever it was didn't bother to stay quiet. They walked around the cabin, dragging something against the walls. The sound was rough, like metal scraping wood. My skin went cold as I listened to it slide along the outside walls. At one point, the person banged on the wall, one single hard thud before continuing to walk. The cans on the windowsills rattled, but didn't fall. I sat shaking, my hand on the knife, my breath shallow. The steps continued for hours, sometimes stopping for long stretches, sometimes circling again. By the time the sky lightened, the steps finally faded away. When I opened the door in daylight, my stomach turned. There were deep scratches along the outside walls of the cabin, as if someone had dragged a blade or a sharp tool against it. The footprints were everywhere, circling again and again. Whoever it was had been out there the entire night. That morning, I made my decision. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed my things quickly, stuffing them into my bags. I loaded everything into my arms and stepped onto the trail back to the car. My eyes scanned the trees constantly, my ears straining for any sound. The walk felt endless. Every snap of a twig made my heart jump. More than once, I thought I saw movement in the trees, just a shape, a shadow, too quick to be sure. I didn't stop to check. When I finally reached the clearing where my car was parked, my chest tightened again. The car door was open. I knew I had locked it before. My stomach dropped as I approached. The inside was a mess, my bags thrown around, the cooler overturned. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been disturbed, as if someone wanted me to know they had been there. I shoved everything back into the car as fast as I could, slammed the doors and started the engine. The drive out of the woods was a blur. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following, but the road stayed empty. When I reached the main road and finally saw other cars, I felt a wave of relief. But the relief was mixed with something heavier, a weight that hasn't really gone away since. Whoever was out there in those woods had watched me for days, circled the cabin, and stood just feet from where I lay at night. They never tried to talk, never tried to take anything, never showed themselves. They just wanted me to know I wasn't alone. And that was enough to make me realize I'd never go back to that cabin again. I went to the cabin to get away from everything for a while. It was deep in the woods, far from any town, a place where no phone signal reached and where the nights got so dark that the trees disappeared into black walls outside the windows. I had rented it for a week because I wanted quiet and because I thought I needed to feel what it was like to be cut off from the constant noise of the city. The cabin was small, built of old wood that smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and it sat at the end of a long dirt road that was so narrow I had to drive slowly just to make sure I didn't scrape the sides of my car against branches. The first day was simple. I carried my bags inside, looked around, and checked everything. The kitchen was basic, just a stove, a fridge that hummed faintly, and a sink with a pump faucet that groaned whenever I used it. The living room was one open space with a couch, a small table, and a wood stove for heat. There was one bedroom in the back with a thin mattress that dipped in the middle when I sat on it. The bathroom was just a toilet and a small shower stall, the kind with old cracked tiles that always looked slightly damp even when dry. I unpacked my food supplies, a cooler full of meat, bread, and vegetables, and stacked firewood near the stove. Everything seemed fine. I felt a little uneasy the first night, but I thought that was normal. Being alone in such a silent place makes the mind wander. I locked the door, shut the windows, and lay in bed listening to the ticking of the cooling stove and the faint creaks of the old wooden walls. The second night was when I first noticed something. It was late, maybe around midnight, and I had been reading with a flashlight because the single lamp in the cabin barely lit the room. I turned the flashlight off and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and that was when I heard it. A soft crunch of leaves, faint but distinct, just outside the cabin. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. The woods were full of animals. But then I heard it again, and this time it was slower, heavier, more like the sound of a boot pressing down on dry leaves. I froze and listened. The sound came again, a deliberate step, then another. It was close, right outside the window of the bedroom. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it against my ribs. The steps stopped after a moment, and then there was silence again. I waited, lying completely still, staring at the faint square of the window in the dark. After a long time, I convinced myself that it was probably just my imagination. Maybe an animal had stepped on something heavy. Maybe the woods just played tricks on me when I was tired. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The air was cool and damp, and the ground around the cabin was covered in leaves and pine needles. I walked slowly around to the side of the cabin where the bedroom window was, and that was when I saw them. Footprints. Clear prints pressed into the soft ground, the shape of boots. They weren't mine. I had been wearing sneakers since I arrived, and the tread didn't match. These were larger, deeper, like someone had stood right there under the window in the middle of the night. My stomach tightened as I looked at them. I felt exposed standing out there in the daylight, because whoever had made those prints had been close enough to touch the wall of the cabin while I was lying in bed inside. I walked the perimeter of the cabin carefully, scanning the ground. The prints led from the trees toward the cabin, then stopped right by the window, then turned back toward the woods. They vanished a few yards into the undergrowth. I stood there staring at the trees, but there was nothing, just silence and stillness. The rest of that day, I tried to keep busy. I cooked food, chopped some firewood, went for a short walk down the dirt road. But the whole time I felt uneasy. I kept looking behind me, listening for footsteps, scanning the trees. I tried to brush it off as maybe a hunter or a hiker who had passed by, but it didn't feel right. The cabin was far from any trail. Nobody had a reason to be this close. That night, I made sure the door was locked, and I stacked a chair against it just in case. I closed the curtains tight, though they were thin and didn't block much. I sat on the couch with the flashlight in my lap and tried to stay calm. Hours went by in silence. Around midnight, I thought I heard something again. Faint movement outside, but when I held my breath and listened hard, it faded. I don't know if it was real or just my nerves. I eventually dozed off sitting up on the couch, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. The fourth day, I started noticing other things. The woodpile I had stacked neatly was disturbed. Logs were scattered on the ground like someone had been pulling them out. In the dirt near the back door, I found another footprint, pressed deep into the soil, bigger than mine. My hands shook as I stared at it. Whoever it was, they were coming back. That night was worse. Couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the window, listening. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it clearly. Footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on leaves. They moved around the side of the cabin, stopped, then moved again. I could hear them outside the front door, then on the side near the kitchen, then under the bedroom window again. My mouth went dry. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The footsteps went on for what felt like hours. At one point, the doorknob rattled, just a faint metallic click, as if someone was testing it. I wanted to get up and grab something heavy to defend myself with, but I was frozen in bed, unable to make a sound. Finally, after a long time, the noises faded. I lay awake until dawn, my body stiff and aching, my eyes burning from exhaustion. When the light finally came, I checked outside. There were more prints, clear tracks circling the cabin, going from one window to another around the back, stopping at the door. The ground told the story of someone slowly walking around me while I was inside, unable to do anything. By then, I was terrified. I thought about leaving, but the cabin was rented for the week and my car was parked right outside. To leave, I would have to pack up, step outside, and load the car while being completely exposed. I told myself maybe I could wait it out. Maybe it was just someone messing around. But deep down, I knew it was worse than that. Someone was watching me. That day, I stayed inside with the curtains drawn. I barely moved. I listened to every sound, every creak, every rustle outside. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind, just heavy stillness pressing in on the cabin. When night came, I felt sick with dread. I sat on the couch again, the flashlight and a kitchen knife in my hands. Hours passed. Then I heard it. Soft, steady footsteps approaching from the woods. They came closer, then stopped. I strained my ears, heart thudding. The silence stretched. Then I heard the faint crunch again, closer this time, right outside the wall. I gripped the knife tighter, my palms sweating. Suddenly, the sound of wood creaking. The porch. Whoever it was, they were on the porch. Then the sound of the doorknob turning, slow and deliberate. The chair I had wedged against the door pressed slightly, the wood groaning. My whole body tensed. I didn't breathe. After a long pause, the knob released, and the footsteps moved away again. That night felt endless. I didn't sleep at all. I waited in silence, my body trembling, until dawn. When morning came, I made my decision. I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into bags without care. I didn't eat, didn't shower, didn't even think. I just packed. My hands shook so bad I dropped things and had to pick them up again. When I stepped outside with the first bag, the sunlight felt thin and cold. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints, dozens of them, overlapping, circling. My car sat where I had left it, but even from a distance I saw something wrong. The back tire on the driver's side was flat. I dropped the bag and ran to the car. The rubber was shredded, not just punctured, cut deliberately with something sharp. I checked the other tires. 2 more were slashed. My chest went tight. Whoever had been out here at night hadn't just been watching. They had made sure I couldn't leave. I stood there in the morning silence, staring at my car, the ruined tires, the empty dirt road stretching away into the trees. My breathing turned shallow. I felt trapped. The nearest town was miles away. No phone signal, no way to call for help. Just the cabin, the woods, and whoever was watching me. I dragged my bags back inside and locked the door again. I felt dizzy, weak, but I forced myself to think. I couldn't stay here another night. I had to leave, even if it meant walking. I filled a backpack with water, food, a flashlight, and the knife. I stuffed everything else in a corner. I left the car behind and started walking down the dirt road. The forest was silent as I walked, the only sound my footsteps on the gravel. Every few minutes I looked behind me, but the road stretched empty. The trees crowded close, their branches arching overhead, blocking out the sun. The farther I walked, the more exposed I felt, like eyes were on me from somewhere in the trees. I walked for hours. The road I had decided to spend a week in an old cabin that I had rented deep inside the woods. I had wanted quiet for a long time, a place where I could escape the noise of the city, get away from the constant rush of cars, people, and machines, and just hear nothing but the sound of wind through trees. The cabin was far from any main road. To get there, I had to drive nearly 3 hours out of town and then another hour along a narrow dirt road that twisted deeper and deeper into the forest until I came to a small clearing. The cabin stood at the edge of that clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed endless. The first thing I noticed about the cabin was how isolated it felt. There were no other houses around, no lights, no sound of engines in the distance. It felt like the kind of place where no one would hear you if you screamed. The nearest store had been about 40 minutes away from where the dirt road began, so I had loaded my car with supplies: food, water, camping gear, a first aid kit, and a few tools. I had brought more than I thought I would need because I did not want to risk having to drive back into town too soon. The cabin itself was small, made of old logs that had darkened with age. The roof sagged slightly, and there were patches where moss had grown between the shingles. The front porch creaked when I walked on it, and the door stuck when I pushed it open, but inside it was simple and clean enough. There was one main room with a small kitchen area, a fireplace, and a bed against the far wall. A single window looked out into the trees, and another faced the clearing where I had parked my car. There was no electricity, no running water, only a few lanterns and a hand pump outside near a rusted metal basin. I felt a sense of peace when I unpacked my things. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the smell of pine needles and damp soil. I set my food in plastic bins to keep animals out, placed my sleeping bag on the bed, and stacked some firewood near the fireplace. By the time I was done, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. The forest grew dark fast, the shadows stretching long, the light fading quicker than in the city. When the sun finally dropped, the silence became heavy. I lit a lantern and sat on the porch, listening. At first, all I could hear were the crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I realized how complete the quiet was, like the world had stopped moving. The first night passed without anything unusual. I kept the lantern burning low, and though I heard a few noises outside, branches snapping, something moving through the brush, I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. I was in the woods, after all. The second day, I hiked a little around the cabin. I followed a faint path that led deeper into the forest. The ground was soft with layers of pine needles, and my boots sank into the damp soil. The trees stood so close together in places that very little sunlight got through, and the air felt colder there. After about an hour, I turned back. I didn't want to get lost. I noticed, though, when I came back, that the cabin looked smaller and more fragile than before, like it could easily be swallowed up by the forest if you turned your head away too long. That night, something changed. I was lying in bed with the lantern out, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a sound outside. It was faint but clear. Footsteps, not the light, random steps of an animal. These were steady, deliberate, slow. Someone was walking outside the cabin. My heart started pounding. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps circled the cabin, crunching softly over leaves and twigs. I told myself maybe it was just an animal, maybe a bear, but bears don't walk in such a careful circle around a cabin. I stayed completely still in the dark. The footsteps stopped near the porch. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard the creak of the porch boards, the same sound they made when I walked on them. Someone was standing right outside the door. I gripped the flashlight I kept by my bed, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. After what felt like forever, the porch creaked again, and the footsteps moved away. Slowly, carefully, they faded into the forest until I couldn't hear them anymore. I lay there all night, too afraid to move. Every sound outside made me tense. When the sun finally rose and light filled the cabin, I stepped outside. The clearing looked the same, calm and empty. I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground. In the damp soil near the porch, I saw them, shoe prints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, wider, heavier. Someone had definitely been there. I spent most of that day on edge. Every time I looked into the trees, I felt like someone could be standing just beyond the shadows, watching me. I decided not to hike again. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some firewood, filled water at the pump, and tried to keep busy. But I kept checking over my shoulder. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and kept the lantern on. I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't come to the porch. They stopped somewhere near the edge of the clearing. Whoever it was just stood there. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves as if they shifted their weight, but they didn't move closer. Felt like they were waiting. They stayed there for a long time, and then, like the night before, they moved away into the woods. By the third day, I was no longer calm. I started to realize how far away I was from help. There was no cell signal here, no neighbors, no one to hear me. I thought about packing up and leaving, but a part of me didn't want to give in so quickly. Maybe it was some hunter who had stumbled onto the cabin and was curious. Maybe it was just someone passing by. Still, the shoe prints bothered me. They were too close, too deliberate. That afternoon, I checked the edge of the clearing. On the far side, where the trees grew thick again, I saw more footprints leading into the woods. They weren't old. The edges were sharp, not worn down by rain or wind. Whoever it was had been there recently, probably last night. I stood there staring at the prints, feeling the forest press in around me. That night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a noise at the window. Not footsteps, not the porch creaking, but the sound of fingernails lightly tapping on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. My chest tightened. The window was only a few feet from my bed. Slowly, I turned my head. The lantern was out, but there was enough moonlight to see the outline of the window. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow pass by it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped. Then the footsteps came again, moving toward the back of the cabin. I heard them pause near the pump, then circle back toward the trees. After that, silence. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay much longer. The cabin no longer felt like a retreat, felt like a trap. But when I went to start my car, I froze. The driver's side door was open. I was sure I had locked it. My supplies were still inside, but the glove compartment was open, papers scattered across the seat. Someone had been inside my car. My hands shook as I closed the door. I wanted to leave right then, but the dirt road was rough and narrow. Driving it at high speed could have been dangerous, and I wasn't sure if whoever was out there was waiting along the road. I told myself I would leave first thing in the morning. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the chair with my flashlight in one hand and the fire poker in the other, staring at the door. The woods were alive with sound. Snapping branches, faint crunching leaves, and sometimes, what I swore were footsteps coming closer and then fading again. At one point, I heard the pump squeak as if someone was trying to use it. When dawn came, I wasted no time. I packed my things quickly, barely eating. I loaded everything into the car, checked the road ahead, and started driving. My heart didn't slow down until I was miles away and finally saw the outline of a gas station. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there those nights. Maybe it was someone living in the woods. Maybe it was someone who had been watching the cabin for a long time, waiting for someone like me to come alone. All I know is that the footprints, the tapping on the glass, the open car door, it was all real. I still think about how easily it could have ended differently if I had stepped outside at the wrong time or if I had stayed one more night. I learned something out there. Silence is not always peaceful. Sometimes silence means someone is close, listening, waiting.